Hey everyone, and welcome back to Stories for Sleep. I know a lot of you listen to these stories to help you relax and drift off to sleep. But before you close your eyes, I have a little favour to ask. If you can, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. It's always fun to see how many places around the world we're connecting with. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a new one. Now, it's time to get comfy and relax. Let's forget about everything for a moment and enjoy tonight's story together. Ready? Let's begin. The phone buzzed, a soft vibration that echoed in the quiet of the apartment. It was almost an insult the way it broke the silence. She'd been sinking into the comforting hum of nothingness, the kind of peace you find only in the late hours of the night when everyone else has either gone to sleep or gone somewhere else entirely. The kind of silence that felt warm, like a blanket around her soul. But now, this. Reluctantly, she reached for the phone, half hoping it would be nothing. A spam call, a text from an old friend she didn't care to reply to, something trivial that would justify throwing the phone back on the couch and returning to her dark corner of stillness. It wasn't any of that. It was a voice note, an audio message from an unknown contact. She stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the play button. It was strange. There were no words, no name or number identifying the caller, just a blank line where the contact details should have been. Her thumb, slick with unease, finally tapped the button. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the words came, simple but chilling in their delivery. "Help me!" Her breath caught, instinctively holding it, as if that might somehow prevent the words from seeping into her bones. It was faint, quiet, a voice as thin as a whisper, yet sharp enough to feel like a knife against her skin. There was something about the delivery, distant, desperate, but also distant, as if it came from a place too far away for her to reach. She frowned, her brow furrowing as she pressed the phone to her ear once more. The voice was unfamiliar. It didn't belong to anyone she knew, yet it felt strangely urgent. She turned the phone over in her hands, examining it as if she might somehow divine an explanation from its sleek surface. Her mind raced through possible scenarios, an old friend trying to prank her, someone she'd forgotten about using a fake number, but none of them felt quite right. The voice, so raw and desperate, didn't fit. She hit the replay button. This time there was only static, harsh, crackling noise that rattled her nerves like a storm pounding at the windows. She closed her eyes as if shutting out the noise could somehow end the disquiet in her chest. It was maddening. She could feel the hairs on her neck stand up, the kind of creeping chill you get when something deep down tells you that something is wrong. Something she couldn't name, couldn't place. She waited for the static to fade, but it lingered. Not just in the phone, but in the room. The walls around her seemed to hum, a faint vibration under her fingertips, though she knew it was all in her head. "Help me," the voice said again, but this time it was quieter. So quiet she almost didn't hear it. She leaned forward, her breath shallow as she listened. It came again, in the same low, trembling voice. But this time it felt different. It felt closer, too close. She stood, her feet moving before her mind could catch up, the phone still pressed to her ear, as if it might tell her something, anything that would make sense of the panic twisting inside her. There was no one else in the room, no one hiding in the shadows. The apartment was hers and hers alone, quiet except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the phone in her ear. She checked the door, the windows, nothing. Everything was locked. It was just her. Her stomach twisted as she glanced back at the phone, still playing the message over and over again. But the message was changing now, slowly, subtly. The voice. It was getting clearer, more distinct, not just a voice anymore. There was something else in it now, something almost familiar. Her own voice. She hit the pause button, the phone going still in her hand. The sound didn't stop though. Her own voice, clear as day, was still echoing in her head, looping through her thoughts, pressing against the walls of her skull. "Help me," it repeated. Not the voice of a stranger anymore, but hers, her own. She could feel her pulse quicken, a bead of sweat forming along the back of her neck as the reality of it slowly sunk in. It was impossible. How could it be her voice? How could it be mimicking her in such an unsettling way? She had never recorded anything like this, nothing even close to it. Her phone was barely more than a tool for texting and checking her emails. She didn't leave voice memos, didn't leave strange messages for herself, but still, to pull, like gravity turning against her. She replayed it. The voice said it again. "Help me!" This time, it wasn't just an echo, it was layered, her voice repeating itself, faintly under the static. Then, the distorted noise of an unfamiliar person shouting her name. But no, this wasn't a name. It was a warning. She felt it before she could even process the words. And that was when she knew something had changed. She could feel it pressing on the air, settling in her chest like a weight. Her hands were trembling, and when she put the phone down, she still couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting. There was something else in the room now. She glanced around, her eyes frantic, darting over every corner, every shadow. Nothing moved, but the hairs on her arms stood up. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. The static on the phone didn't stop either. It persisted, crackling, fading in and out like it was trying to send her some message, some signal she couldn't quite understand. She was just about to toss the phone aside, tell herself it was nothing but a glitch, an old number crossing wires, when the phone buzzed again, cutting her thoughts short. Another message, but this time it was different. The screen showed a timestamp, and just under the timestamp, the message read, "I'm right behind you." Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around quickly, her pulse hammering in her ears, her eyes wide, searching the space behind her, the shadows that seemed to stretch too long, but no one was there. No one was standing behind her or anywhere else. Still the coldness in the air remained, sharp and unrelenting. She felt her stomach twist, a familiar sense of dread rising in her chest like bile. She didn't know what this was, but she knew deep down that it was only just beginning. The phone buzzed again, but this time she couldn't bring herself to check it. She stood there in the quiet, the walls of the room pressing in on her, as if she were no longer alone. The voice was still there, and it was coming for her. The phone buzzed again, sending a jolt through her chest. Her heart skipped a beat, as though it had stumbled for a moment, confused by the sudden rush of panic that flooded her veins. She stared at the screen, her hands still trembling as she held the phone, but her mind refused to wrap itself around the idea of answering. She couldn't. She wouldn't. The message read the same as the last one. "I'm right behind you." Her throat went dry as she scanned the apartment again, every shadow now feeling like a potential threat. The kitchen was empty. The hallway leading to the bathroom was as still as it had been moments before. Nothing had moved. No one was there. There had been no footsteps, no creaks in the floorboards, and yet the sensation in the air was undeniable. The same feeling of being watched, of being observed, lingered like a cold mist around her. she shoved the phone into her pocket, as if doing so could banish the dread that had taken root deep in her chest. There was a rational explanation for all of this. There had to be. A wrong number, a malfunction in the system. Anything that would make sense of this terrifying, illogical sequence of events. But her mind wasn't listening to her logic anymore. It was busy replaying the voice, her voice. The voice that had first called out to her in desperate, pleading tones before it slowly, unnervingly, began to mimic her. And the moment that timestamp had appeared on the screen, the unmistakable message, "I'm right behind you," had shattered whatever fragile comfort she had left. The apartment was too quiet, the kind of silence that left room for things to settle into the corners of the walls, things that weren't supposed to be there. She pressed her back against the doorframe of the bedroom and breathed deeply, trying to steady herself. The air felt thick with something she couldn't quite place. But that feeling, the one she couldn't shake, the sense that something was in the room with her, was still there. She could almost feel it, the pressure on her skin, the way her pulse thrummed in her neck, so much louder than it had any right to be. Her mind flickered back to that moment when the message had arrived, the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the dread creeping in. Could someone have broken in? Could a neighbor be playing a cruel joke? The rational answers didn't fit. They never did. And the more she thought about it, the more the irrational questions made sense. What if the voice wasn't coming from someone outside the apartment? What if it was coming from inside? She shook the thought away, as if by doing so she could shake off the fear that had started to take root. But it wouldn't leave. It was stuck to her skin like a film, thick and sticky. Without thinking, she moved towards the living room, half dreading what she might find, half hoping she was just imagining things. But no matter how much she willed the room to stay the same, to remain unchanged, she knew something was off. She could feel it. The couch, her familiar, worn-out couch, seemed too empty. The lamp beside it flickered, a brief, irregular stutter in its light, as though it were trying to tell her something it couldn't say out loud. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder now, oppressive, like the very walls of the apartment were closing in on her. A soft buzz interrupted her thoughts. The phone. Again. She didn't want to look at it. She didn't want to hear it anymore. The thought of the voice repeating itself over and over, of it mimicking her, was enough to send her heart into a frenzy. But she knew she couldn't keep ignoring it. The pull was too strong. With trembling hands, she fished the phone out of her pocket and stared at the screen. Another message. This time, the message was different. No "I'm right behind you," no cryptic words or threatening tones. Instead, just one phrase. "It's you." Her breath caught in her throat. The words, so simple, so direct, were like a slap to the face. It felt like they had been meant for her, meant to remind her of something that she had forgotten, or something she had once known. The hair on the back of her neck prickled as she reread the message, trying to understand it. She wasn't sure whether she was more frightened by the message itself, or by the fact that it sounded as though the voice already knew her so well. But it wasn't just the words that unsettled her. It was the sound beneath them. She played the voice note again, desperate to hear anything that might offer her some clue. "Help me." It wasn't quite the same voice she'd heard before, not exactly, but it was close. So close that her stomach twisted into knots. It had changed somehow, gone from a distant plea to a strange echo, one that felt personal. Almost as if the voice was now a reflection of her own. The static that accompanied the voice was different too. It had stopped being just static, and now it was more like a hum, a low, vibrating hum, deep and resonant, something that vibrated inside her bones. She put the phone down and walked across the room, rubbing her temples, trying to shake the feeling of nausea that was creeping up her throat. The room had become oppressive, thick with something she couldn't explain. When she looked back at the phone, she found that another message had appeared, almost as if it had been waiting for her to look. "I'm in you." Her heart dropped into her stomach. The blood drained from her face as she stumbled back, her back hitting the edge of the coffee table with a sharp thud. She felt dizzy, light-headed, as if she were standing on the edge of something she couldn't fully understand, something she couldn't grasp. It wasn't just the words on the screen that were making her feel this way. It was the voice. The way it had shifted from desperate to intimate, from a plea for help to a cold, calculated message that felt like a warning. She gripped the phone tightly, her knuckles white, as she held it to her ear again. The hum was louder this time, almost unbearable. It wasn't just coming from the phone anymore. It was everywhere, vibrating through the walls, through the air, through the very floor beneath her feet. And then, as if the room itself was holding its breath, she heard it. A whisper. It wasn't the voice from the phone, it wasn't even the same tone, but it was unmistakable. It was her. "Help me." The words whispered out loud in the same soft, desperate tone. And then, a voice that wasn't hers, that had never been hers, said one simple thing. "You don't remember, do you?" The whisper filled the room, cutting through the space like a blade. It was no longer just in the phone, it was in the room with her. She looked around, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was nothing there. No one, just the oppressive silence and the faint static. And yet it was like the air itself was alive now, heavy with an unspoken truth. And that truth was something she wasn't ready to face. The voice was getting closer. The whisper echoed in the silence, a breathless hiss that seemed to come from all around her. "You don't remember, do you?" The words hung in the air, curdling like sour milk in the heavy, thick atmosphere of the room. It wasn't her own voice. It couldn't be. It was far too cold, too alien to belong to her. But it sounded like her. The cadence was the same, the rhythm, the timbre. It was as if her voice was being stretched thin, manipulated, twisted into something darker, something wrong. She stood frozen in place, the phone still clutched in her hand, her palm slick with sweat, heart racing, and a bitter taste rising in her mouth. For a moment, everything was still, and she thought, just for a moment, that perhaps it had been a trick of the mind, a hallucination, her thoughts spinning out of control in the dark of her lonely apartment, playing cruel tricks on her as she tried to make sense of a reality that no longer seemed entirely real. But then the voice spoke again, and this time it wasn't just a whisper. "You were always supposed to remember." Her blood ran cold. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the floor as if they had become one with the very wood beneath her feet. The voice, it was her voice again, but this time it was layered over with something deeper, more guttural, like an echo from the depths of a grave. It was like listening to the ghost of herself, a version of her trapped in the static of the phone, clawing to get out, clawing to speak. Her stomach churned, the sickening sensation of being both too close to something and too far away from it at the same time. She could feel her skin grow cold, the temperature in the room dropping so suddenly that her breath came out in visible puffs, as if the room itself had become the interior of a tomb. I'm not going crazy," she muttered to herself, but her voice cracked, betraying the trembling uncertainty that gripped her insides. She staggered backward, her mind racing for something, anything, that could explain the situation. The voice on the phone, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, the sudden weight of the air around her like a thick, oppressive fog that wouldn't lift. Nothing about this made sense. The rational part of her brain screamed that this had to be a prank. Someone who knew her, someone who had gone too far, someone who had learned to hack into her phone. But there was no logical explanation for the creeping sensation in her chest, the fear that clawed its way through her veins like ice. No explanation for the voice that now seemed to be attached to her very soul. She dropped the phone onto the coffee table, the sound of it hitting the wood, echoing through the room. The buzzing stopped, but the static didn't. The hum was still there, buzzing low and insistent like the buzz of a forgotten insect in the dark corners of her room. The walls themselves seemed to hum in response, vibrating with something ancient, something terrible. She turned, pacing the floor, her breaths coming faster now. There had to be a way to make it stop. She could block the number, turn off the phone, throw it out the window for all she cared, but nothing seemed to work. The voice had already invaded her mind, settled into her thoughts like a parasite, feeding on her fear. "You're not alone anymore," it whispered again, this time almost laughing, the words curling around her like a snake, suffocating her. Her pulse quickened, a throbbing ache in her temples. She stumbled to the window, her hand on the frame, pushing it open in a desperate attempt to breathe in the cool night air. But when she did, the world outside seemed as dead as the room behind her. No cars on the street, no movement in the shadows, just stillness. The kind of stillness that pressed against her chest made her feel as though she were trapped in some strange, limbo-like space between the real world and something far darker. She closed the window with a quick motion, as though the very act of doing so might somehow prevent whatever was happening inside her apartment from leaking out into the world. It was only when she turned back toward the room that she noticed it, the shape. A shadow in the corner, near the bookshelf. It wasn't moving, not at first, but it was there. A dark silhouette against the dim light of the apartment. She blinked, and in that blink, the shape seemed to grow, stretching unnaturally, almost like it was shifting, like it had a life of its own. Her breath hitched in her throat. She couldn't tell if it was the shadows playing tricks on her eyes, or if there was something truly in the room with her. But she didn't care. She had to get out. There was no rational explanation for what was happening, no way to deny that something far more sinister was at play than a simple prank or malfunction. She had to leave, but her legs felt frozen to the floor, the weight of the air, of the presence in the room, pressing down on her, making it hard to move. "You don't remember, do you?" the voice asked again, and this time it sounded like it was coming from inside her own head. Her head whipped toward the bookshelf, eyes wide, and there, just beyond the edge of the room, there was something that made her blood run cold. The voice wasn't just speaking. It was mimicking her now, imitating her every movement, every thought, as if it had become part of her, as if she were no longer just herself anymore. Her heart hammered in her chest, her throat tightening as she took a tentative step toward the corner, as if some unseen force was dragging her forward. And then she heard it, her own voice, too clear, too loud in the quiet of the apartment. "Help me!" It was as if it had come from the walls themselves. The very air around her vibrated with it. She spun around, looking for the source, her eyes darting over every inch of the room. But there was nothing. Nothing. Except the shadow. It was closer now, a dark figure crouched low in the corner, its features indistinct, but its presence undeniable. And with that presence came the cold, the freezing cold that sank deep into her bones, that made her feel as though her blood had turned to ice, as though her very soul were being dragged into some abyss. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her mouth. Her body had betrayed her, her lungs useless, her limbs locked in place. The room was closing in, the walls pressing against her with a force that made it harder to breathe. And then she heard it again. It's too late. Her own voice, but not hers, not really. This time, it wasn't pleading. It was certain, cold. And the shadow moved, the form stretching unnaturally across the floor, like a living thing, crawling toward her, its darkness swallowing the light around it. She took another step back, her body no longer obeying her commands. Her legs were shaking so violently that she could barely stand. The room, once a safe place, was now an inescapable prison. "Help me," the voice whispered one final time, the words a terrible echo reverberating through the walls, through the very air. And this time it wasn't asking, it was commanding, and she knew with an undeniable certainty that it was no longer just a voice. It was her, and it was coming for her. Her breath was shallow, like the last gasp of air before drowning, and her legs, heavy, numb, refused to obey. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run, but her body was paralyzed, locked in place by the sheer weight of the dread that poured from the dark shape in the corner of the room. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something worse, something living, something aware. The voice, that cold, unfeeling imitation of her own, echoed through her mind once more, this time sinking into her thoughts like a poison. It's too late. And as the words floated through her brain, it was too late. She knew it with a sickening certainty. The figure in the corner, the one that had stretched across the floor in impossible ways, wasn't just a shape. It had substance now, a vague outline, blurry and shifting, as if its very form was made of smoke and shadows, slipping through the cracks in the walls. Its edges warped and writhed, making it impossible to focus on. The air around her seemed to hum with it, vibrating like a tuning fork, the sound humming so low it almost felt like a physical sensation brushing against her skin. It saw her, and that, more than the terror, more than the cold, creeping dread that curled in her stomach, was what made her freeze. The dark shape seemed to grow taller, its form shifting in ways that defied logic. It wasn't like a shadow. It was like something pulled from the deepest parts of her mind, something that had no business being in her apartment, in her reality. It was her, but it wasn't. And that was the thing that made her blood run cold, the feeling that she wasn't just in danger from this thing, but that she was somehow becoming it, or worse, that it was becoming her. "I'm not going crazy," she whispered to herself again, the words trembling on her lips. It was the only mantra she could hold on to now, even though she wasn't sure if she believed it anymore. And then she heard it again. It's too late. The voice. Her voice. The sound slithered through her thoughts like something alive. It was all around her, not just in her mind, but seeping from the walls, from the floor, from the very air she breathed. The walls themselves felt alive, vibrating with an intensity she couldn't explain. The apartment was too quiet, and yet there was noise everywhere now. The soft scrape of something unseen against the floorboards, the faint scratching of something dragging across the walls, the buzz of the lights above her, buzzing like insects trapped in a web. And then the unmistakable sound of scratching, like claws dragging against the drywall, slow and deliberate, each stroke dragging the air tighter around her. Her body screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed by the terror, by the feeling that whatever this thing was, whatever this thing had become, it wasn't just in the room. It was in her mind. It was inside her thoughts. inside her skin. She gasped for air, stumbling backward, but there was no place to hide, no escape. The thing in the corner was closer now. It had moved in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't just a shadow stretching across the floor. No, now it was here, looming dark, an undeniable presence. It was in the room with her, and when she tried to scream, she couldn't. It was as if her voice had been stolen, her mouth sewn shut with fear. She clutched her chest, willing her heartbeat to slow, but the thudding in her chest only quickened. She stumbled toward the door, her hands grasping the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The doorknob wouldn't budge. A horrible realization dawned on her then. The door wasn't locked. It couldn't be. She knew she hadn't locked it. She'd never locked it before. Yet now it felt as though something was holding it closed. Something was blocking her escape, as though it were an invisible force pulling her back toward the center of the room, toward the thing that had slowly, painfully become her worst nightmare. "Let me out." The words were barely a whisper, but they were enough to carry the weight of her terror. And then the sound. The scraping noise again, this time closer, from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. It was as if the apartment itself had become part of the thing in the corner, its skin, its cells, its very bones. The walls, the floor, everything seemed to pulse with it, moving in time with the low, insistent hum that filled the air. It felt like the room had grown smaller, tighter, as though it was slowly, steadily shrinking around her, pushing her closer to the darkness that had taken form. And then came the voice again, a low, guttural repetition of the same phrase. "Help me!" It wasn't just her voice anymore. It was a chorus of voices now, rising and falling, overlapping each other. Some of them were hers. She could recognize her own tone, her own inflection, but others were not. Other voices slipped in, distorted, wrong, echoes of people she didn't recognize, all calling out in a strange, horrifying harmony. Her heart pounded in her chest, her ribs threatening to crack beneath the pressure. She tried again to reach for the door, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the doorknob. The coldness in the room was unbearable now, as if the temperature had dropped to the point of freezing, and she could feel her breath misting in front of her face, each exhale sharp and visible in the air. With a final, desperate motion, she yanked the door open. The world outside didn't make sense. The hallway was different. She didn't know how, but it was. It was darker, as though the very lights had been dimmed to their lowest setting. The air felt thick with something, like the static that had followed her in the apartment, and the walls seemed to lean in, pressing closer to her as she stepped into the hall. And then, just as quickly, she heard it again, the unmistakable voice, now so loud and close that it sounded as if it were right behind her. "It's you." She spun around, but there was no one there. The hall was empty. And yet it felt like the empty space was a lie. Like the shadows were hiding something, something that she couldn't see, but that she could feel, like the cold fingers of the darkness curling around her heart. And then came the most horrifying thing of all. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was more oppressive than anything she had ever experienced. It was deafening in its stillness, a quiet that felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. That silence was the worst part. It was waiting for her to remember, waiting for her to become it. The silence clung to the hallway, thick and suffocating, like a blanket draped over her chest. The air was still, but the hum was there, faint and relentless, like the pulse of some unseen heart. It vibrated in her bones, a sound that was more felt than heard, but it was there, pulling at her every nerve. The darkness, now deeper than before, stretched ahead of her, swallowing the edges of the hallway, the shadows creeping toward her like a living thing, wrapping itself around her mind. She couldn't move. Her legs were leaden, as though they were shackled to the ground. The door behind her, still hanging open, offered no comfort. The apartment she'd fled from was no longer a refuge. It had become a part of the nightmare, a prison, and the walls, the very bones of the place, felt as though they were closing in on her, slowly, steadily, as though they, too, were a reflection of the thing that had followed her. "Help me," the voice repeated. But this time, it wasn't just her own. This time, it was everything. Her own voice, yes. But there were others now, layered over hers, twisting and overlapping, distorted versions of herself, warped and unrecognizable. The sound filled the hallway, curling around her like smoke, suffocating, choking. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was listen to the sound of herself being torn apart by the darkness. She wanted to scream. She needed to scream, but her throat was frozen, her mouth dry. The world around her felt like it was slipping away, dissolving into fragments, breaking apart in front of her eyes. The shadows on the walls shifted again, stretching toward her, curling around her like tendrils, dragging her into the darkness. The floor beneath her feet seemed to give way, as though the very foundation of the apartment was sinking, the edges of the hall warping, folding in on themselves. She was sinking into it. The walls, no, they weren't walls anymore. They were eyes. The dark shapes on the walls were watching her, judging her, their eyes filled with an ancient hunger, the same hunger she had felt when she first heard the voice, the same hunger that had followed her, that had now consumed her mind, body, and soul. And the most horrifying part, she realized with sickening clarity that she knew what it wanted. It didn't just want her fear, it didn't just want to haunt her. No, this thing, this presence, wanted her. It wanted to become her, to replace her. "I'm in you," it whispered, the voice now indistinguishable from her own. She wanted to run, to escape, to do anything to break free from the grip of the thing that had taken root inside her mind. But there was nowhere to go, no way out. The hallway stretched on, impossibly long, but it felt like she was running in place, her feet dragging, her body weighted down by something far more than gravity. The eyes were everywhere now, staring at her, waiting, and each one of them whispered the same thing. "It's you." The walls themselves seemed to twist, folding in on each other, collapsing into a vast, infinite darkness that had no beginning or end. The hallway was no longer a hallway. It was a tunnel, a chasm, a void, and she could feel it deep in her gut. The voice, the thing, the presence inside her was closing in, squeezing tighter and tighter until there was nothing left of her except its echo. There was a coldness in her chest, like ice spreading through her veins, like the touch of something that wasn't human, wasn't alive, and yet it was alive, alive in the most unnatural way. It was crawling beneath her skin, moving through her thoughts, twisting her memories. It was her, but not. She could feel it, pulsing through her, the last remnants of her identity slipping away, melting into the static. Her own reflection no longer looked like her. She reached out to touch the wall, no, the eyes, and the moment her fingers made contact, the world around her shattered. The shadows, the voices, the static, everything folded inward, collapsing into a single point, a blinding light, and then nothing. For a brief moment, she thought it was over, that she had finally escaped. But as the darkness bled away, she found herself standing at the edge of something far worse. The apartment was gone. The hallway was gone. Everything she had known was gone. And before her, standing tall and silent in the center of the emptiness, was a mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her anymore. It was the thing. It stood there, in her place. Its eyes, black as pitch, glistened with an unfathomable hunger. And as she stepped closer, she saw it clearly. It was wearing her skin. The reflection moved when she moved, a perfect imitation, a perfect echo. But there was something wrong with the eyes. They weren't her eyes. They were cold, empty, lifeless. "Help me," it whispered again. It wasn't her voice. Not anymore. It was the voice she had heard on the phone, the voice that had mimicked her, twisted her, taken over. And as she reached out to touch the mirror, to break the silence, to scream, she realized, too late. She wasn't the one trapped in the mirror. It was her. And now there was no way out. The echo would never stop. It was the kind of thing you could almost ignore at first. The slight shift in the bed, a few inches to the right or maybe to the left. It was easy to dismiss, especially in the haze of the early morning, just before the first light of dawn fought its way through the closed curtains. But after a while, it became harder to ignore. And after that, it became harder to deny. Ben never thought much of it. He was an ordinary man, or at least that's how he liked to think of himself. A low-level accountant with a small second-floor apartment in a complex that smelled of old carpets and stale air. Nothing in his life had ever been extraordinary. It was predictable. Comfortably so. Until the bed started moving. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. It wasn't like one of those horror stories you read about, where the bed was suddenly floating above the floor, or where you woke up to find your body trapped inside a nightmare of twisted sheets and levitating furniture. No, this was different. This was subtle, almost imperceptible. He first noticed it after the first week of strange shifts. The bed would move a couple of inches, just a small nudge, and the sheets would be tangled differently. It was as if the mattress was inching its way toward the far corner of the room, ever so slowly. Ben shrugged it off, figuring maybe he was moving it in his sleep. Perhaps in the restless tossing and turning he was known for. After all, the nights had been getting warmer, and the room was stuffy. Maybe his movements were simply pushing him toward a cooler spot on the floor. But it didn't stop. Night after night, the bed moved. Slowly, imperceptibly. First a few inches, then a few more. And after a while, he started to notice the odd gaps in the room. The way the bed no longer sat at the center of the space, like it had when he first moved in. No longer aligned with the dresser or the old lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. The edges of the carpet where the bed once lay, now exposed to the air, were dark and worn, the fabric fraying ever so slightly. The space around it, once familiar, now felt wrong, off-kilter. Like something had shifted beneath the floorboards, something that wasn't quite visible, but still there, pressing its weight against the walls. Ben was no fool. He wasn't some child with an overactive imagination. He'd checked the bed frame, checked the floor, checked the floorboards. There were no creaks, no signs of some strange anomaly beneath him, making the bed move. No loose bolts or wobbly legs. Everything appeared to be in order, as ordinary as it could be. But still, every night, he woke to find it a few inches further away from where he had fallen asleep. The first time it happened was a Tuesday. Ben woke up, the alarm clock flicking to life at 7:30 a.m., the mechanical buzz of the numbers on its red display filling the air. He stretched, eyes half closed, the way you do when you've had too little sleep and too much work, and glanced around the room, hoping the grogginess would pass with the daylight. But when he looked around, his gaze fell upon the bed and stopped. His first thought was that his mind was playing tricks on him. He had gotten up to pee in the middle of the night, hadn't he? Maybe he had pushed the bed by accident, nudged it as he moved and forgot about it. But as he stared at the bed now, his eyes adjusted to the dull light of morning. He couldn't deny it. The bed was not where it had been when he fell asleep. The edge of the bed, which had once been flush with the wall, now stood at least 3 inches away from it. The position of the pillow, normally lined up precisely with the center of the headboard, was off. Just enough to make Ben feel uncomfortable. It wasn't a huge difference, not something that should have sent a chill down his spine, but in the cold light of morning, with his head still foggy from sleep, it did. A prickle of unease settled on the back of his neck, and he stared at the bed for longer than was necessary. He shook it off. It's nothing, he thought. I'm just being paranoid. He'd spent too many nights working late, too many nights drinking 1 too many beers to get the sleep he needed. He had to be imagining things. But as the days went on, the movements of the bed grew more noticeable. Every morning it was a few more inches away from where it had been the night before. Eventually, he started measuring it, tapping the ruler along the floorboards like he was some kind of mad scientist, charting an experiment. But no matter how precise he was, no matter how much he tried to convince himself that there was a rational explanation, perhaps a shifting floorboard, perhaps his own sleepwalking, the truth began to dawn on him. It wasn't his imagination. The bed was moving. He could feel it now in the pit of his stomach. That undeniable sense that something in his life had become unmoored, like the floorboards beneath him were slowly turning to sand. The bed was not simply moving from night to night, it was moving toward him. It started slowly as before, but now it wasn't a few inches anymore. It was a foot, then 2, then 3. Each night the bed crept closer, and each morning he woke in the same twisted confusion. He had tried to rationalize it at first, tried to ignore it as just another oddity of his life. But now, each time he woke, he couldn't help but feel the press of something darker, something more insidious, hiding just beneath the surface. He began to avoid the bed, refusing to lie down until the very last moment, reluctant to climb under the covers for fear of what might happen next. But even then there was no escape. No matter how much he tried to stay awake, no matter how much he fought the urge to drift off to sleep, the bed would always be waiting for him when he returned. And each time it was a little further from where it had been. It didn't stop there, though. No, soon the bed wasn't just moving across the floor, it began shifting in other ways. The shape of it began to change too. The once soft, comforting mattress seemed to lose its familiar contours. The springs in the frame made strange creaking noises like something deep within it was alive, waking from some long, dreamless sleep. The room too began to feel wrong. The walls closed in on him at night. The windows, once a source of calm, now felt like portals to something else, something that had no business being outside his small, unremarkable apartment. Each night the darkness pressed closer to him, and the corners of the room grew deeper, darker, impossible to measure. It was the last Friday of the month when it happened. Ben woke up to find that the bed was gone entirely. The room was empty, cold. The space where his bed had been was just a vast, empty stretch of floor, marked only by the outline of where it had once rested. The bare floorboards stared back at him as if mocking him. He sat up, breathing heavily. The air felt damp, thick with a chill that had not been there when he had gone to bed. He turned in a circle, his heart pounding in his chest, his pulse rushing in his ears. The room was completely different, but nothing had moved. It was as if the bed had never been there. But the worst part, the bed didn't disappear. It was still there, somewhere, and it was closing in on him. Ben's heart thudded against his chest. each beat louder than the last, each pulse more frantic as he scrambled to sit upright. The room had become a blur of confusion and panic, his eyes darting from corner to corner, searching desperately for any sign of the bed. But there was nothing. Only the same bare floorboards, the same walls he had grown familiar with, now suddenly alien. He blinked several times, willing the darkness at the edges of his vision to recede, but it only deepened. The bed, the thing that had become his constant companion for months, was gone, vanished, and the silence in the room pressed in on him like a vice, suffocating him with its emptiness. "What the hell is happening?" he muttered, barely able to form the words. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. He swung his legs off the side of the bed frame, or where the bed frame used to be, and planted his feet on the cold, wooden floor. He stood unsteady, as if his body had forgotten how to function. He reached out to steady himself, grasping for something to hold on to, but all he had were the walls which now felt like they were closing in on him too. The corners seemed sharper, more pronounced, the room suddenly much smaller than it had been only hours before. The silence was so deep it felt like it was pressing against his eardrums. Ben's eyes flicked to the window. It was still dark outside, the faintest hint of dawn barely peeking over the horizon. The city beyond was still and quiet, a ghostly silhouette against the night sky. But none of that mattered. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the impossibility. How could the bed just be gone? He had fallen asleep in it, hadn't he? It had been right there just a few hours ago. But now it was as if the room had swallowed it whole. He moved to the center of the room, his feet making soft, hesitant taps against the floor, as though expecting it to shift beneath him at any moment. He felt dizzy, light-headed, as though the very air was too thin to breathe. The familiar walls now loomed around him like a cage, the shadows crawling up them in unnatural ways. He reached out, hands trembling, running his fingers over the bare floor, hoping, praying that the bed would reappear, as if it had simply shifted in the night to another corner. Nothing. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He had to focus. He couldn't let the panic consume him. Not yet. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something he was missing. He turned, half expecting to see the bed waiting for him in the corner, as if it were playing a cruel game. But the longer he stared at the room, the more he felt the weight of something watching him from the darkness. The shadows seemed to shift ever so slightly, warping in unnatural ways. That's when he heard it. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a faint scrape, like the sound of something being dragged across the floor. Ben's head snapped toward the sound, his pulse quickening. It was coming from the farthest corner of the room, near the window, the spot where, just hours ago, the bed had rested. No, Ben thought. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, as he slowly crept toward the sound, his feet dragged across the floor, as though the wood itself was sticky, trying to hold him in place. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder as he approached, scraping, dragging, like something heavy was being moved inch by inch, pulling across the floorboards. Ben reached the corner, his heart pounding in his ears. His hand was trembling as he reached out for the curtain, pulling it aside. Nothing. The corner was empty. The sound had stopped. But then he felt it, just a slight shift in the air, a cold breeze, like a hand brushing lightly against his neck. His skin prickled with the sensation, and he spun around. The room still felt wrong, twisted somehow. That was when he noticed it, a faint line on the floor, visible only in the dim light of the morning. It wasn't a shadow, it wasn't dust. It was something else, something more sinister. The outline of where the bed had been. The wood beneath the bed had worn in a way that left a ghostly mark on the floor. But there was something off about it. Something that Ben couldn't quite place. His eyes narrowed, and his mind whirled with frantic thoughts. He crouched down, running his hand across the floor, feeling the texture of the marks, trying to make sense of it. And then, beneath his fingers, he felt it, the faintest tremor, a pulse beneath the surface, like something alive. A chill ran through his spine. He jerked his hand away as if burned. His thoughts were reeling, trying to catch up with the fear flooding his body. He backed away from the spot, his eyes darting around the room. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. This wasn't just about a bed moving. This was something else, something bigger, darker, and it was closing in. What's happening? His breath came in shallow gasps, his pulse quickening, his chest tightening. There had to be some explanation, there had to be, but as he stood there, staring at the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to grow, stretch toward him like fingers reaching out. The marks on the floor began to seem less like scratches and more like something deeper, like a scar, something ingrained in the very foundation of the apartment. Something trying to find its way back to him. Ben swallowed, trying to steady himself. He was being irrational. He was being paranoid. He had to calm down. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the result of too many late nights and too little sleep. But the shadows in the corners of the room were beginning to take shape, twisting in ways that no natural light could explain. His breath caught in his throat as they seemed to grow, crawling across the floor like living things, hungry and restless. He turned to leave, desperate to get out of the room, but his legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative. His feet wouldn't move. He was trapped. The door, which had always been within reach, felt miles away now, like it was on the other side of an impossible distance. The shadows in the room seemed to grow more distinct, no longer just shifting in the corners, but now creeping across the walls, crawling toward him like something that had been waiting for this moment. Then a faint sound broke the silence, a soft scraping noise, so low that Ben almost didn't hear it. It was coming from behind him, from the farthest corner of the room. He slowly turned, his heart racing, and there it was, the bed. It wasn't just shifting anymore, it was moving, dragging itself across the floor toward him. The mattress was creaking under an unseen weight, and the metal frame groaned as if it were protesting the motion. It was alive, it seemed, its movements slow but deliberate, inching closer to him with each passing second. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, but his feet wouldn't obey him. His body felt frozen, as though something had gripped him from the inside. He tried to move, tried to run, but the bed was closing in on him, moving faster now, its creaks and groans echoing through the room. He turned and bolted for the door, but it slammed shut in front of him with a deafening bang. He turned around to find the bed mere feet away, its metal frame scraping across the floor as it dragged itself toward him, a relentless living thing. The room was closing in, the bed was coming for him, and there was nowhere to hide. Ben's mind raced, but all he could think was one thing. It was never going to stop. The room seemed to close in around Ben like a vice, each breath growing more labored as the space shrank. The bed was now just a few feet away, the sound of its metal frame scraping against the floor like nails on a chalkboard, a low, guttural groan that seemed to reverberate deep in his chest. It was too much noise, too much movement, too much weight in the air. He could feel the oppressive heat pressing against him, the walls pushing in like the tendrils of some unseen force, suffocating him. He tried to take a step backward, but his feet wouldn't move. What the hell is happening? His thoughts were jumbled, a frantic scramble of half-formed ideas and desperate survival instincts. He couldn't run, he couldn't escape. Every time he tried to move, his body refused to obey, frozen by some invisible, suffocating force. His legs felt like lead, the room spinning as his mind raced with thoughts of what the bed could be, what was behind it, what was driving it. It didn't make sense, none of it made sense, and yet there it was, pressing toward him with the inexorable force of something alive, something predatory. Why is it coming for me? Ben swallowed hard, his throat dry, his hands shaking. He tried to scream, tried to shout for help, but his voice got stuck in his throat, a choking sound that barely escaped his lips. The shadows seemed to lengthen, stretch and crawl like living things, reaching for him, trying to pull him into the dark corners of the room. The bed's creaking grew louder, its frame now dragging across the floor with an almost deliberate rhythm. It was as though it was no longer an object, but a predator, hunting him in the silence of the night. I need to move. I need to get out. He turned again, scrambling for the door, his hand reaching out for the knob. But it was too late. The door slammed shut on its own, the sound deafening in the otherwise silent room. Ben recoiled, a jolt of terror coursing through his body as his eyes flew to the window. Maybe he could break the glass, escape through the window, anything to get out of the suffocating grip of this place. But even as he turned toward the window, his gaze locked on it. He knew that wasn't an option either. The window was already covered in a thick, unyielding darkness, something more than night, more than shadows. It was as if the window had become a barrier, a sealed gate that had been shut long before he ever thought to try. The bed groaned again, louder now, and Ben felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. It was too close. He could hear the springs straining, the fabric of the mattress shifting as it inched closer, dragging itself across the floor like some grotesque crawling thing that was never supposed to be alive. The metal frame scraped again, and this time it wasn't just the noise. He felt it. The vibrations. The shuddering of the floor beneath his feet. The bed was coming for him, moving with an unnatural purpose. It's alive, it's alive. The thought struck him with such force that his breath caught in his throat. No, that wasn't possible, was it? Beds didn't move on their own, they didn't crawl. They didn't get up in the middle of the night and drag themselves toward you. This couldn't be real. He had to be losing his mind. He backed up, his eyes wide with fear, his legs trembling beneath him. The bed was closer now, almost close enough to touch him. Its heavy frame seemed to pulse, the creaking louder, more insistent. The air around him grew thick with the stench of sweat and fear, and the shadows on the walls stretched farther, impossibly long, as if they were being drawn to him like magnets. The weight of them pressed down on him, and he could barely breathe. The bed, or whatever it was now, was too close. He couldn't think straight. He couldn't escape. He turned to face the wall, his back pressed against it, but it felt wrong. The wall felt wrong. He reached up, his hands scraping against the plaster, and he shivered, a wave of nausea washing over him. The plaster beneath his fingers was cold, unnaturally cold, like it had been frozen from the inside. But that wasn't possible either. None of it made sense. Then, without warning, he felt it. A tugging, a pulling sensation from the center of the room. His breath hitched as his body jerked forward, his legs moving without his command, his arms swinging helplessly. The bed, it was dragging him toward it, the heavy mattress scraping like some terrible thing that wanted to swallow him whole. His feet slid across the floor, unsteady, as if the wood beneath him had turned to ice. His body was moving against his will, his feet stumbling over the uneven floorboards as the force of whatever was driving the bed toward him grew stronger. He tried to fight it, tried to dig his heels in, but it was useless. His body was being pulled toward the center of the room, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "No, no!" his mind screamed, but his body wouldn't obey. The shadows in the room twisted, and for the briefest moment, Ben thought he saw them move, as though the darkness itself was stretching out, reaching for him, beckoning him closer. The floor beneath him buckled, shifted, and he was falling into the grip of something cold and hungry. He reached for anything at all, and his fingers brushed against the cold metal of the bed frame. He grabbed it, desperate for something solid to hold on to, but it was no use. The bed continued to drag him, pulling him toward the center of the room, where the shadows thickened, growing darker and deeper, pressing in from all sides. With a final, gut-wrenching sound, the bed stopped. Ben's body slammed into the edge of the mattress, and he was caught in the suffocating weight of the darkness. The room was silent now, save for the sound of his own breathing, ragged and frantic, echoing in his ears. He dared not look up, he dared not move, and then from behind him came a soft, groaning noise, the kind of sound you hear when something is trying to stand, trying to shift, trying to rise. The bed, it was rising, not just in place, but shifting, growing, expanding into something larger, something that shouldn't be. It was becoming something else, something new. The shadows pressed in around him, the darkness overwhelming, and Ben's heart raced in his chest, hammering against his ribs. He felt a pulse in the air, something that reverberated deep inside his bones, something ancient, hungry, and alive, and he knew with a sickening certainty that the bed had found him. It wasn't just coming for him anymore, it had him. He was trapped. Ben couldn't move. His body felt like it had turned to stone, as though every muscle and bone had been locked in place, frozen by the weight of the room, the presence that had taken over it. The bed, or whatever it was now, seemed to expand before his eyes. It wasn't just the bed anymore, it was something else. Its metal frame groaned and rattled as if it were alive, its springs snapping and creaking like the bones of some great beast coming to life. The mattress shifted beneath him, its fabric rippling like water, pulsing, moving in waves. Ben could hear the sound of the springs groaning in rhythm, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him, a dark, predatory pulse that thudded in the silence of the room. It was closer now, closer than it had ever been, and the shadows around him grew thicker, denser. They curled in on themselves, twisting into shapes that looked almost human, stretching across the floor, across the walls. The darkness was everywhere now, clinging to him like a second skin. I have to move, I have to get out of here, but his body betrayed him. It refused to obey, heavy as lead, his feet glued to the cold floor. His hands shook violently, his fingers twitching as if to grasp something, anything, but nothing was close enough. The shadows seemed to grow taller, pressing in, their edges sharp and jagged like teeth. The bed, if that's what it still was, continued to grow larger in his mind's eye, expanding outward like some grotesque, living thing. It was closer now, so close that he could feel the air shift as it moved. He could feel its presence pressing against him, as though it was aware of him, as if it knew he was there. The scent of old wood and dust filled his nose, the stench of something decaying, something that didn't belong in a room like this. Something that belonged in the dark, in the forgotten places. Ben's eyes flicked upward, his heart hammering in his chest. The ceiling, once solid and unyielding, now seemed to ripple, distorting above him. He could see the patterns in the plaster warping, bending, as if the whole room was shifting, twisting, folding in on itself. The very air around him seemed thick and heavy, like breathing through wet cloth. It felt wrong. Every inch of this room, every inch of his existence in it felt wrong. The bed was alive and it was getting closer. The wheels on its frame. Where had those come from? He didn't remember there being wheels before, scraped across the floor with the sound of nails on stone. A high-pitched screech that made the hairs on his neck stand up, that made his teeth ache with the sound. Then the most disturbing thing of all happened. It spoke. Not with words, not with language, but with a presence, a sense of intent that settled deep inside him like a stone. The air seemed to crackle with static, the room humming with an unnatural energy. A faint whispering began, so quiet at first that Ben almost thought it was just the wind. But it wasn't the wind, it wasn't natural. The whisper grew louder. Ben clamped his hands over his ears, trying to drown it out. No, but it didn't stop. It never stopped. The whisper became a voice, low, guttural, like something dragging itself across the floor, trying to claw its way into his mind. The words were distorted, garbled, but Ben could make them out, could feel them inside his skull, reverberating through his thoughts like a twisted melody. Get out, get out, get out. Ben's breath hitched. His pulse raced as the whisper grew more insistent, louder, more forceful. The words repeated themselves over and over again, a mantra, a command. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping sharply. He could feel it now, something cold like an icy hand creeping up his spine, stealing his breath, making his skin crawl. Get out, get out, get out! It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was him, the whisper. It was his own voice, distorted, twisted, like it was echoing from deep within the depths of the earth itself. The words felt like an order, no, more like a demand. The room was suffocating him, closing in on him from all sides. The shadows that had stretched across the walls now seemed to converge, creeping toward him, pulling at him, dragging him in. The walls closed in with every passing second, the space growing smaller, more cramped. The bed was so close now that Ben could feel the vibrations of its movement beneath his feet, the creaking of the springs in his bones. It was a sound that went beyond hearing. It reached him, digging deep into his mind. I need to get out. The thought screamed through him, but his body refused to respond. The whispers, that maddening, torturous voice, pressed in from every side, their words blurring together like a chant, a prayer, something ancient and far too powerful. He tried to turn, to flee, but as soon as he moved, the floor shifted beneath him. The very ground seemed to buck beneath his feet, forcing him back toward the center of the room. The bed dragged him, pulled him, its springs straining, its weight shifting, growing heavier, more oppressive. His body could not fight it. His legs were no longer his own. His hands that clawed at the floor, felt numb, useless. The whispers intensified. Get out! Get out! The voice twisted, distorted, cracking under the pressure, growing louder, faster. His voice, but not his voice, but wrong. Ben screamed. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't breathe. The pressure in the room was too much. His vision blurred as his chest heaved, the room spinning, disorienting him. The shadows pressed tighter, their edges cutting through the air, crawling up his legs, his arms, until he could feel them wrapping around his throat. Get out! Get out! Get out! A hand, cold and clammy, wrapped around his wrist. He tried to pull away, but it was too strong. The grip tightened, the fingers digging into his skin like iron, pulling him toward the bed. No! Ben screamed, but the word was swallowed by the chaos, drowned out by the maddening whisper, the force of whatever was driving the bed forward, closing in on him. He could feel the cold breath of the thing, whatever it was, against his neck. It was closer now, and he could feel it, its presence, wrapping around him, curling into his skin. The last thing he remembered was the overwhelming weight of darkness, pulling him under, swallowing him whole. The bed had him now, and it wasn't letting go. The darkness was absolute. No light, No sound, no sense of time. Ben's world had become a void, a thick, suffocating silence that pressed down on him from all directions. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest heaving as he fought to reclaim control of his body, but it felt as though something was suffocating him from the inside out. Every part of him seemed numb, his limbs heavy, unresponsive. Where was he? What had happened? The weight of the room was gone, the oppressive air that had choked the space with an unnatural stillness lifting, if only slightly. His mind was a fog, but the flickers of thought, of awareness began to creep back, threading their way through the haze. His fingers twitched first, his hands moving ever so slightly before he realized he was alive. The weight around him wasn't death, wasn't a suffocating darkness. It was something more terrifying. It was the absence of everything. Then, without warning, his body jerked forward as if his mind had given a command it could no longer control. He wasn't on the bed anymore. Ben's heart raced, his chest tightening as panic surged through him. He was lying on cold, uneven ground, the floor beneath him rough and jagged, almost like stone. His body ached, muscles strained in ways they hadn't been before, and his throat burned as though he had been screaming, though he couldn't recall a single sound escaping his lips. The air smelled strange here, heavy, like damp earth mixed with decay, and something else, something foul, like something rotting beneath his skin. Ben opened his eyes, blinking against the dim light that filtered into the space. He felt the familiar pressure of the floor beneath his palms, but his surroundings were wrong. The room wasn't his own. It couldn't be. The walls were jagged and cracked, the ceiling low and oppressive. The windows, if they could be called that, were covered in a thick, black substance, blocking out any trace of the outside world. And the bed was gone. The only thing that remained was the cold, creeping sense of something watching him, something just outside his reach, waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to face the truth. Ben's breath caught in his throat as he scrambled to his knees. His hands searched desperately for anything solid, anything to anchor him in this nightmare. His fingers brushed the ground, feeling the roughness of the stone beneath him, but something wasn't right about it. The texture shifted under his touch as though it were made of flesh, not stone. It pulsed beneath his palm as though the floor itself was breathing. A low, guttural sound filled the air, the kind of sound that vibrated in your bones. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the sound of the earth groaning under pressure. It was something else. Something alive. He wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his throat again. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat like a drum, urging him to run, to escape, but his limbs felt sluggish, detached from his mind. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, rising from the floor like tendrils, stretching toward him, pulling at his skin. And then the whisper started again. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was inside him. The words burrowed into his mind like parasites, gnawing at his thoughts, making him dizzy, disoriented. The whispers grew louder, as if 1,000 voices, his own included, were speaking all at once. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The chant reverberated in his skull, rattling his thoughts, his sanity piece by piece. His hands shot up to his head, trying to block it out, but it didn't work. It never worked. The words were inside him, crawling, writhing like worms beneath his skin. He had to escape. But where? The room was closed in, suffocating. The bed, the thing that had once been a simple piece of furniture, had become something else entirely. It had swallowed him whole, dragged him down into this twisted nightmare. Ben's eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out. He couldn't stay here, couldn't let the whispers take him, couldn't let the shadows crawl into his flesh. The ground beneath him felt unstable, shifting as though it were alive. He stumbled to his feet, his legs weak, like they were made of rubber. His balance faltered, and he collapsed to the floor again, gasping for air. The whisper grew louder, more demanding, as though it were growing frustrated with his resistance. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" His hands flew to his ears, pressing hard, trying to block out the sound. But it didn't work. The words only seemed to get louder, more insistent. He felt them crawling into his mind, digging deep, scratching at his thoughts. Ben tried to stand again, to find his way out of this hellish place. But something held him down, something stronger than his will. The floor beneath him shifted again, the ground trembling as the shadows around him thickened, closing in. And that's when he saw it. The bed had returned. It wasn't the same bed that had stood in his apartment. No, this was something far worse. It was massive, its frame twisted and warped, as if it had been constructed from the very darkness around him. The metal groaned under some unseen weight, its springs snapping and popping with the force of an unseen presence. The bed was moving again. No, not just moving. It was alive. Ben's blood ran cold. The air seemed to freeze around him as he realized that the bed wasn't just an object. It wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore. It had become a thing, a creature, a living, breathing monstrosity. And it was coming for him. His limbs trembled, his body on the verge of collapse as the bed dragged itself across the floor, each creak and groan of its metal frame a sound that sent chills down his spine. He could feel it coming for him, its presence so overwhelming, so suffocating, that the very air in the room seemed to thin, as though it were being drawn toward the bed's insatiable hunger. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The voice wasn't his anymore. It wasn't anyone's. It was the voice of the room, of the bed, of the darkness itself. And it was commanding him to leave. But there was nowhere to go. The bed had him now. And as it loomed over him, its twisted form casting long, sharp shadows that clawed at the edges of his vision, Ben understood the horrifying truth. There was no escaping it. There was no escape from this. The bed wasn't just shifting anymore. It had moved him. It had brought him here. And it wasn't letting him go. The bed had consumed him, and now it would consume his soul. Ben's scream, raw and desperate, echoed in the endless void. And then there was nothing. It started with the twitch, a small, inconspicuous twitch, barely noticeable at first, just a fleeting spasm of his left eyelid that made Noah furrow his brow in confusion. He rubbed his eyes, blinked a few times, and shrugged it off. He'd been staring at his computer screen for hours, the dull hum of the office air conditioning mixing with the endless tap of keys. It was nothing, he thought, probably just fatigue. The twitch came and went for a day, maybe two, but it became harder to ignore with each passing hour. It wasn't like a muscle spasm in his leg or an odd cramp. This was a slow, almost rhythmic movement that never quite went away, as if his eyelid was determined to flicker in its own private dance, no matter how hard he tried to stop it. By the third day, Noah was frustrated, exhausted really. He could feel it happening with every passing moment, like an involuntary tic that was no longer simply irritating. It felt like his body was betraying him. His colleagues at work didn't seem to notice. They were all too busy, heads buried in their own screens, too engrossed in their meetings and mundane office drama to even glance up at him. Noah tried to push through, focusing on his work, pretending he could ignore the constant pull of his eyelid. But by the end of the week, it had gotten worse. He was sitting in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel after a long day, trying to calm his breathing before he made the drive home. The movement in his eye was relentless, now pulsing in sync with his heartbeat. as though it had a mind of its own. His skin around the eye felt strange too, tight, like something was just beneath the surface, something unnatural. Noah glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a split second, just a fraction of a second, he thought he saw something in his reflection. Something wasn't quite right. His left eye twitched again, but this time it wasn't just his eyelid. The eye itself felt wrong. The sensation crawled up his spine, unsettling and foreign. He looked again more carefully, but the mirror only reflected what it should, a tired, worn-out version of himself. He took a deep breath and shook his head, trying to brush the thought away. "It's just stress," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible in the confined space of his car. "Just stress. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. That night, as he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Noah couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching him. His eyelid twitched again, and it wasn't the usual spasmodic flicker. It was a movement, something pulling, tugging, like his eye wasn't fully in his control. He clenched his fists under the covers, trying to force his body to relax, to stop it. But the twitching continued, relentless, like a small engine running in his head that couldn't be turned off. At some point, in the midst of his frustration, he sat up and glanced at his reflection in the window across the room. The moonlight spilled through the blinds, casting eerie shadows that made the room feel alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Noah's gaze settled on his own face, his tired, drawn face. Then it happened again. His eye twitched, but this time it didn't stop. It didn't feel like a simple spasm. It felt like it was searching for something. His gaze, involuntarily, moved to the corner of his vision. A small shift in the darkness, a slight, flickering distortion, something unfamiliar in the reflection. Noah blinked and rubbed his eyes hard, but the sensation didn't go away. And then he saw it, something staring back at him from the corner of his eye. It wasn't his own face, not entirely. It was a distorted version of him, but the eye, the left eye, was different. It was too large, too wide, its iris spinning slowly in its socket, watching him from the reflection. The rest of the image, his face, seemed blurry and warped, like it was caught in the heat of a mirage. Noah froze. His breath hitched in his chest, a heavy, cold feeling spreading through his body. The figure in the mirror wasn't him, not entirely. It looked like him, yes, but something was deeply wrong, something that he couldn't put into words. The reflection's left eye didn't twitch. It moved. His left eye, the one that had been twitching uncontrollably, shifted slightly, tracking his movements in the mirror. He felt a chill run through him, as though the very air around him had grown colder. A shiver crept down his spine. Noah's breath came faster now, panicking, but the mirror held its gaze. He tried to move his head to get a better look, but the reflection didn't follow his command. The eye, it didn't move with him. It stayed fixed in place, staring, watching. It was as if it had a life of its own. The cold sensation settled deeper in his bones, spreading outward from the center of his chest, creeping into his limbs. The twitching continued, no longer a subtle annoyance, but a constant pull, a tug that felt as though it were ripping his flesh. He wanted to reach up, to grab his eyelid and hold it still, but his hands felt numb, disconnected, useless. "Get a grip, Noah," he whispered to himself. "It's just the mirror. It's just a trick of the light." But his voice didn't sound convincing, even to his own ears. There was something in the air now, something unexplainable, something alive that he couldn't escape. He took a step back from the window, his legs shaking beneath him, but as he did, his reflection stayed in place, staring at him with that unnatural, wide-eyed gaze. The image didn't shift. It didn't blink. It only stared, unmoving, waiting. Noah turned away from the mirror, his heartbeat pounding in his ears, as if something was about to rush out at him from the shadows, from the very reflection. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it was already there, inside him, in his own body, as though his reflection wasn't just watching him. It was him, moving on its own. He stumbled toward the door, desperate to get away from the mirror, but the room felt smaller now, suffocating. The walls closed in on him, and the reflection lingered in his mind, that strange, flickering vision of the eye, watching, waiting. The twitching wasn't stopping. Noah could feel it more intensely now, as though it was coming from inside him, as though the eye itself was trying to escape, to push itself out of his skull. The sensation, a mixture of pain and wrongness, spread from the edge of his eyelid all the way down to the base of his neck. He pressed his palm against his face, trying to hold the twitching at bay, but it only seemed to worsen, becoming violent, uncontrollable. The reflection was in his head now, its eye, his eye, watching him with an unnatural, predatory stillness. And it was moving again, this time closer, like it was inching toward him. Noah couldn't take it anymore. He stumbled back toward the bed, trying to clear his mind, trying to focus on the present. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. That eye, it wasn't his. He was beginning to understand something. He had no idea what was happening, but he felt it. Something had changed. Something had begun, and it wasn't just his eye anymore. It was something else, and it was coming for him. Noah woke up the next morning with a sickening sense of dread that clung to his skin like damp clothes, heavy and uncomfortable. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his eyes feeling like they were weighed down with sand. That twitch, that damnable twitch. It was worse now, every few seconds, a little pulse of movement that rippled through his eyelid like a tremor, too persistent to ignore. The thought of it, the feeling of it, made him want to claw his own face off. He hadn't gotten any sleep, not really. Every time he tried to close his eyes, he saw it, that eye, that hideous thing staring back at him from the mirror, watching him in a way no reflection ever should. His body ached, like he'd been crushed under a pile of bricks. His shoulders were tight, his neck stiff, and his head felt as though it were full of fog, thick and impenetrable. He didn't want to face the mirror again, but he knew, deep down, that he had no choice. There was no escaping it, no getting away from what was happening to him. He had to see it again. He slowly pushed himself upright, his legs trembling, and swung his feet to the floor. The chill of the morning air crawled across his skin, but it didn't feel cold. It felt wrong. His feet landed on the cold hardwood floor, and as he stood, the floor creaked beneath him, a groan that echoed in the silence of the room. Every sound felt too loud, every movement felt too deliberate. The mirror was on the opposite wall, just across from his bed, the thin silver frame catching the dull light of the early morning. Noah knew he couldn't avoid it. Not now. He didn't even want to. He walked over to it slowly, his feet dragging like they were sinking into the floor with each step, his legs heavy as though they were made of lead. When he stood in front of it, his reflection was the same as before, his tired face, his unshaven jaw, his messy hair. But there was something different. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on, the eye. His left eye twitched again, the sensation more insistent now, more violent. It pulled at him from the inside out, as though his own eyelid was trying to crawl off his face. And then he saw it, the same grotesque thing, the twisted version of himself, the distorted reflection with the wide, unblinking eye. Noah froze. It wasn't just twitching anymore, it was moving. It was moving independently, like it had a mind of its own. He could feel it too, in his own eye, that horrible sensation of something foreign lurking behind his vision, a presence that wasn't him. The reflection, the thing that was supposed to be his image, was alive now, its own eye fixated on him, following his every movement, while his own eye remained locked in place, twitching uncontrollably. He tried to look away. He couldn't. It was as though the mirror had him trapped in its gaze, the reflection staring at him, waiting for him to react. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands, as if he could pull himself away by sheer willpower, but the reflection didn't flinch. It didn't blink. The eye watched, and Noah felt something primal stir within him, a creeping horror that sank into the pit of his stomach and crawled up his spine like icy fingers. It's not mine, he thought. That eye is not mine. His breath hitched, and his heart began to pound in his chest, each beat reverberating through his whole body, making his skin prickle with cold sweat. The twitching, the sensation of his eye being pulled against his will, the reflection's eye staring at him, unblinking, unnatural, too alive. Noah stumbled backward, his legs shaking, his body suddenly weak. He wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in his throat, thick as tar. His own eye twitched again, and this time it was sharper, more violent, like something inside him was pushing against the skin of his face, trying to escape. He stumbled toward the door, barely able to keep his balance, and opened it, stepping into the hallway, but it didn't stop. The twitching didn't stop. It followed him. Noah looked toward the end of the hallway, his breathing shallow, his thoughts racing, but then his eyes caught the reflection in the mirror on the opposite wall. It wasn't just in the bedroom anymore. The damn thing was everywhere now. It was in the hallway too. The reflection of his eye, the wrong eye, was still there, staring at him from the glass, from the reflection in every reflective surface in the house. No matter where he turned, no matter what he did, it was there, lurking in the corner of his vision, always just behind him, always watching him. His body froze, and for a moment he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Every reflection was the same, the wrong reflection, that eye, that twisted thing, gazing at him with silent malice, as if it were waiting for him to make a move. His own eye twitched again, harder this time, and the pull of it, the pull that he couldn't control, nearly dropped him to his knees. His chest tightened, his throat closed. The air in the house felt suffocating, thick with the smell of something decaying, something old and foul that he couldn't place. He gasped for air, and then, almost without thinking, his hand shot up to his face, pressing against his eye, trying to stop the twitching, trying to force it back. But it wasn't just a twitch anymore. It was a pulse, a slow, rhythmic throb that seemed to have taken on a life of its own. He couldn't stop it. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse, breaking as if the words themselves were too heavy to bear. "Please, just stop." But it didn't stop. It was growing, this feeling, this presence behind his eye, crawling through his body like an infection. Something inside him was changing, shifting, and he didn't know how much longer he could hold on before it completely took over. The reflections in the mirrors grew more twisted, more wrong. He could see them in the windows, in the glass of picture frames, even in the shiny metal of the faucet handles. Every surface became a doorway, a portal to something dark and watching. The eye, his eye, it was everywhere. Then as he stood there, trying to regain control of his body, of his sanity, something far worse happened. He blinked, and the reflection didn't blink. Noah gasped, his stomach churning, as the reflection in the window, his own face, his own eye, stayed fixed in place, unblinking, unyielding. The eye in the reflection was alive, yes, but it wasn't following him anymore. It wasn't responding to him. It wasn't just watching him. It was waiting, waiting for him to look away again, waiting for him to trust it. He didn't. He wouldn't. But it was too late. Noah's hands shook violently, and the twitching, God, it was so strong now, so powerful, began to spread to the rest of his face. His eyelids fluttered uncontrollably, his entire body jerking with the force of it, and with every blink he could feel it. That thing inside him, his own reflection, that eye, was no longer his, and it was coming out. He took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest, but the moment his foot hit the floor, something in the mirror moved, and Noah saw it clearly for the first time, the reflection of his own eye twisting, distorting, pushing out from under his skin. He opened his mouth to scream, but the words were trapped. The eye was no longer his own, and it was coming for him. Noah couldn't remember exactly when he began to scream. His mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. It was as though the sound itself was afraid to leave him. That thing, that other eye, the one that had started as a twitch, was no longer just an uncontrollable muscle spasm. It was something more. It was alive, and it was trying to escape. His hand shot up to his face, his fingers digging into his eyelid, trying to hold it still, trying to stop it, but it was too late. The skin under his fingers felt wrong, like something was squirming beneath the surface. Something foreign. His body was no longer his own. His face was no longer his own. The reflection in the window, his reflection, or whatever it had become, shifted. It wasn't a simple motion. It wasn't just an optical illusion or a trick of the light. The eye in the reflection, his left eye, moved. It stretched open impossibly wide, far too wide, until it was an abyss of nothingness, a pit that seemed to pull at him, as if the entire universe were waiting on the other side of it. He stepped back, his legs like jelly, his heart hammering in his chest. Every time he blinked, the eye in the reflection followed, always watching, always waiting for him to look away again. The skin around his eye burned, felt tight, as though something was trying to crawl its way out from beneath it, trying to break free. Noah gasped, his breath coming in shallow, erratic bursts, but the mirror didn't release him. The eye in his reflection, the thing that wasn't his, smiled. A slow, twisted grin that spread across its face like a spider creeping across a web. He couldn't breathe. His body was seizing, his hands shaking violently as he reached for his face again, trying to hold his eyelids down, to force them to stay closed. But the twitching, the terrible, violent twitching, wouldn't stop. It was growing now. The skin around his eyes stretched tighter and tighter, as if something were pushing against it from the inside, trying to escape. Noah wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. His face felt like it was on fire, his skin burning under his touch. What's happening to me? The thought echoed in his mind, but he couldn't find an answer. The world around him felt distorted, like he was trapped inside a house made of glass. Each step he took making the walls press in closer, the windows grow tighter, the mirrors closer, always closer. It was as though the house itself were alive, and it was watching him. He stumbled toward the bathroom, his mind a blur of panic. But when he passed the hallway mirror, he froze. The reflection was the same, the eye was the same. But now something else had changed. The face, his own face, was no longer just a reflection. It was moving without him. He stared into the mirror, horrified, as his own face grinned back at him. Not in the way he would have smiled, not in the way that would have been natural, but in a grotesque, twisted mockery. The reflection's mouth stretched unnaturally wide, too wide to be real. It was as if the mirror itself had become alive, as if it were no longer just reflecting him, but mocking him. And then, as if drawn by some unholy force, Noah watched in terror as his reflection reached up, slow and deliberate, its fingers curling toward the eye, the one on the left, and then it touched it. Noah's breath caught in his throat. The mirror's hand, his reflection's hand, didn't just touch his eye, it pressed against it, and the skin under his fingers, the skin of his real hand, felt exactly like the hand in the mirror, cold, smooth, slick. The sensation was nauseating. His reflection was no longer mimicking him, it was controlling him, it was becoming him. The reflection's eye, the wrong eye, flashed. It didn't blink, it couldn't blink. It stayed open, wide, unblinking, as though it were staring into some vast, unreachable distance. It was a hollow abyss of blackness, and the longer Noah stared at it, the more he could feel it, it pushing into him, pulling at him from the other side. The thought didn't come to him all at once. It wasn't an instant realization, but a creeping dread that slithered up his spine, curling around his ribs, squeezing tighter and tighter with each passing second. The thing in the mirror wasn't just mimicking him anymore, it wasn't just a twisted reflection of his own eye, it was controlling him. His own eyelid twitched again, and this time Noah didn't control it. The reflection, that thing, controlled it. It made his eye twitch, made his body jerk involuntarily. The sensation of something scraping under his skin, scraping at his very flesh, was unbearable. He could feel it, deep inside, as though his own body was being undone, unraveled, like a sweater that was being pulled apart stitch by stitch. The mirror's eye, the reflection's eye, was still staring at him, still watching him with that unnatural malice. And it was smiling. Smiling in a way that wasn't human, wasn't natural. The smile twisted into something else, something dark and predatory. It's moving inside me. The thought was a whisper, barely there, but Noah couldn't ignore it. His face twitched, his body jerked again, and the mirror's eye twitched with him, following every movement. And then, as if the universe had decided to flip the script on him entirely, Noah saw something that sent him into a full-blown panic. The eye, the wrong eye, was no longer his. It was different now, it was growing, it was taking over. The skin around his left eye stretched painfully, and he could feel the muscles in his face trembling as though something else, something foreign, was pushing its way out. He reached up, terrified to try and stop it, but his hand moved against his will. His fingers clawed at his skin, digging into the flesh, but it was too late. He could feel it, deep beneath his skin, something wriggling, something alive, something that wasn't him. Noah's breathing was erratic now. His whole body was shaking. But it didn't matter. The eye was coming. It was pushing out from the inside, breaking free of his flesh, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. It was taking over. With one last scream, Noah stumbled backward, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he saw something shift in the reflection, something even darker, more twisted than before. And in that moment, Noah realized the truth. The eye wasn't just watching him anymore. It had already won. And now it was coming for him. Noah's body felt like a marionette. Each movement forced, jerky, as though the strings were being pulled from somewhere far outside his control. His hands reached up, not of their own volition, to claw at the skin around his left eye, but it wasn't him doing it. It was that thing inside him, the eye that was no longer his own, taking over. It had begun as a simple twitch, an innocent enough glitch in the system, but now it was an infection, a parasite, and it was spreading faster than Noah could stop it. The pain was unbearable, his fingers digging into the flesh of his face, desperately trying to hold back whatever was trying to crawl its way out. He couldn't breathe. Every gasp, every breath felt like it was being choked out of him, suffocated by the weight of what was happening. His skin burned, each pore on his face screaming in agony as if something underneath it were trying to burst free, trying to make its escape. The thing in the mirror, the reflection, was alive now, no longer just an imitation of him. It was controlling him, pulling the strings in ways he couldn't comprehend, turning him into a puppet. His reflection didn't just copy his movements, it anticipated them, twisting them into something unnatural, something horrifying. He wanted to close his eyes, to hide from it, but the other eye, the one that was no longer his, wouldn't let him. It blinked at its own will. It moved at its own will. It was him now, and he was no longer in control. It's becoming me. The thought burrowed into his skull like a parasite, making him shudder uncontrollably. His hand flew up again, but not because he wanted it to. The reflection in the window, a reflection he could barely recognize anymore, raised its own hand, fingers curling toward the eye, toward the skin, as though it were reaching in, as if it owned his body now. The pull was so strong, Noah could barely keep his footing. His legs wobbled beneath him, and he had to catch himself on the bathroom counter before he collapsed to the floor. His reflection, no, not a reflection anymore, twisted its face into a cruel mockery of Noah's. The smile, the twisted, wicked grin, it wasn't his. It couldn't be. His face wasn't that twisted. His expression wasn't so full of malice. But as he stared, eyes wide, locked on the grotesque version of himself in the mirror, he couldn't ignore the terrifying truth. The smile in the mirror was growing. It stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it seemed as though his face would tear apart. His own lips, his own skin, tugged and pulled in the reflection, the corners of his mouth stretching like rubber, distorting until they formed a wide, wicked grin. But this wasn't him. It was that thing, that parasite, that eye. He gasped in horror, his chest tightening, but the mirror didn't show him gasping. The reflection didn't flinch. It only watched, staring back at him with eyes that weren't his, that weren't human. The reflection blinked, and as it did, Noah felt the twitch in his own eye, felt it tighten, contract, pull at the very muscles of his face as though something inside his skull was pulling at his skin, stretching it further, trying to break free. It was inside him. It had been inside him for so long that he couldn't tell where he ended and it began. It had shifted. This wasn't just a twitching eye anymore. It was something far more sinister. The thing in the mirror had infected him. It had crawled into his body, deep under the skin, and now it was spreading. His vision blurred, his mind going hazy, and he stumbled back from the mirror, his reflection moving with him. His left eye, the wrong eye, twitched violently again. He winced, his teeth clenched in agony as his body jerked, unbidden, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. But it wasn't just his eye anymore, it was his whole body. Every nerve, every muscle in his face seemed to throb with the same violent pulse, the same terrible urge to escape, to get out. Noah stumbled forward, clutching his face in a frenzy. He couldn't stop it. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop it. The eye, it wasn't his. It couldn't be. He reached up, but his hands no longer felt like his own. His fingers, trembling and cold, moved with unnatural precision, pushing, pulling, digging into his flesh, trying to force the eye to stop, to close, to let him have control again. But as his hands pressed against his face, the skin beneath them shifted. It was like pressing on something soft and wet, something that wasn't supposed to be there. He felt it move. Something was inside him, his own eye, the one he had known all his life, felt like it was being torn from his skull. His vision blurred as the wrong eye stretched wider, pulling at the edges of his face, pushing itself further out, as though it wanted to leave. to escape his body altogether. The skin around it rippled, and he could hear a strange, wet, squelching sound, like something scraping inside his skull, tearing its way out. He fell to his knees, gasping for air, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His chest heaved with panic, but still, the twitching wouldn't stop. The wrong eye kept pulling, the wrong eye kept moving, and he couldn't stop it. "Please," he begged silently, "please make it stop." But nothing could make it stop. Not his hands, not his screams, not his desperation. The reflection in the mirror was laughing. Noah's hands flew to his face again, his fingers trembling as he felt around the edges of his eyelid, pressing into the soft, tender skin, desperate to find some control, some way to force the eye back into place. But his fingers slipped off as if the skin was slick with sweat, or something worse. He didn't want to think about what it was. The reflection in the mirror was still grinning. The smile, too wide to be real. He couldn't escape it. The reflection was no longer just mimicking him, it was becoming him. Noah tried to pull away from the mirror, but it was like the glass had become a magnet, drawing him back in. He couldn't look away, even as his reflection's eyes stared back at him, moving independently, pulling his focus, forcing him to watch as the eye stretched and pulled its way out of his face. And then, in a moment of pure horror, he saw it. The reflection didn't just smile, it winked, and Noah screamed. The thing, the eye, was no longer inside him. It had taken over. And now it was looking back at him, and it was free. Noah's scream rattled through his skull, bouncing off the walls of the room like 1,000 echoes, but his reflection, that thing, only smiled wider. The face in the mirror, that grotesque, deformed mockery of his own, winked at him with the wrong eye, the one that wasn't his, the one that was no longer attached to him. It winked, slow and deliberate, as though it was savoring every moment of his terror, every pulse of fear that rattled his insides. His heart slammed against his ribs, desperate to escape, but his body felt frozen, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what was happening. "It's not real," he tried to tell himself, but the whisper of the thought was drowned out by the pounding in his chest, the echoing voice of the thing in the mirror, the thing that was inside him. His breath came in shallow gasps. The world seemed to narrow, shrinking around him, drawing in tighter with every breath, every beat of his heart. His body was no longer his own. It never had been. The twitching, the pain, the feeling of something alive behind his eyes. It was all too much, too fast, too overwhelming. It can't be real, it can't be real. But it was. And the reflection, the thing that now was his reflection, was reaching out, stretching its hand towards him as if it were trying to grab him, pull him through the glass, into the abyss behind its eyes. It wasn't just an eye anymore. It wasn't just a strange twitch or a bizarre moment of terror. It had grown. It had become something other, something darker, something that had found its way out from under the surface, under his skin. The sensation of it, of that thing moving inside him, was unbearable. It squirmed, it shifted, as though it were reaching for the world outside his body. And Noah couldn't escape. His hands weren't his anymore either. They had become extensions of that thing, that presence, reaching, searching, finding nothing but the wrongness of it all. He stumbled back, trying to distance himself from the mirror, but no matter how far he moved, no matter how hard he tried to turn away, the reflection followed. His movements were jerky now, his legs too weak to carry him, his head spinning. He could feel it all. The thing inside him, the thing in the mirror. It was connected now. It was pulling him, guiding him, and he had no choice but to follow. It wasn't him, not anymore, not any longer. Noah's hands shook violently as they reached for his face again, this time desperate, pleading. His fingers brushed against his eyelids, trying to hold them shut, trying to block out the wrongness, the twisted blackness that was crawling through him, taking over him. His left eye, the one that was no longer his, twitched again, more violently this time. The skin under his fingertips quivered, stretched, as if something were pushing from within, and Noah could feel it. Feel the thing inside him, the thing that was his eye but not his eye. And in the reflection, the thing in the mirror, it smiled again. Not the way he had smiled, not the way his lips would naturally curl, but something off, something unnatural. It wasn't just a grin, it was a mockery, a sneer, a promise of what was to come. His reflection was no longer simply a reflection, it was becoming him, but not him. Something else, something worse. The room seemed to pulse around him, the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, as if the very space he inhabited had become part of it, part of the thing inside him. The glass of the mirror shimmered, and Noah's reflection, his other reflection, took a step forward. Its eyes, both of them now wrong, fixed on him, unblinking, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for him to understand. Noah stumbled back again, a cold sweat coating his body, his heart racing. He reached out for the door, but before he could grab the handle, something inside him, the eye, that thing pulled. It pulled him with an unrelenting force, as if it had suddenly taken root, as if it had become a part of his very soul, and now it was yanking him, dragging him closer to the mirror, closer to the thing that was waiting for him. No, 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 please. But the words were lost in the roar of his thoughts, drowned out by the blinding pressure in his skull, the relentless twitching in his eye. His face burned, his skin hot and tight as though it were on the verge of splitting open. His hand, his right hand, shot up to his eye again, but it wasn't his hand anymore. It wasn't his eye either. The fingers of his left hand, the one that wasn't his, rose to meet his right, pushing it back, forcing it away, as though something inside his body was fighting him. The room had become impossibly still, but the pressure in his skull grew unbearable, and with it came a sharp, sickening sound, the sound of tearing, of ripping. His vision blurred as he looked into the mirror, and the thing inside him felt like it was being dragged out through his very eye. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't fight it. It wasn't his fight anymore. It wasn't his body. The glass of the mirror rippled like water. Noah's reflection, that distorted, nightmarish version of himself, reached through the glass. Its hand, his hand, reached for his face, slowly, deliberately, fingers long and twisted. It grabbed his skin, but not gently. The grip was tight, cruel, pulling his face toward the glass, pulling him closer, closer, until his forehead was pressed against the mirror, until his breath came in ragged gasps against the cold surface. He could feel the other eye, the wrong eye, pressing in on him, pushing its way free from his skull, and the sensation of it, of it, was more than he could bear. He tried to scream, but the scream was caught in his throat. There was no air, no space to breathe. The pressure was too much, and then snap, he felt it. The thing inside him, the eye, broke free. It tore from his body, and for the first time in days there was silence. The mirror's glass shattered. The room was dark, and in the fragments of glass that lay scattered across the floor, Noah saw his reflection, and yet not. The eye, the wrong one, was gone. But the thing, that thing was still there, watching, waiting. Noah couldn't move. His mind was slipping, unraveling, and he couldn't stop it. But as the world around him spun into chaos, one thought remained, a whisper that would echo for the rest of his days. The eye was free, but it would never leave him. And in the broken shards of the mirror, Noah could still see it. Staring. Watching. Waiting. There was something wrong with the window. Janet could feel it, deep in the pit of her stomach, that crawling sensation that always heralded something off. It had started out innocently enough, a simple glance, the feeling of eyes on her, that flicker of movement she couldn't quite place. But it grew into something else, something more sinister. It had been a few days since she first noticed it, the face, but she wasn't ready to admit what it was. Not yet. Not until she could be sure. But deep down, she knew. She knew there was something out there. It was always at night. The first time she saw it, she had been lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when her eyes caught the faintest shift of motion in the darkness outside the window. Just a shadow, something moving in the corner of her vision. At first, she thought it was the wind rustling the trees, or maybe a passing car casting a fleeting reflection. But the longer she stared, the more certain she became. It was a face. She had gotten up quickly, too quickly, her pulse thumping in her throat as she went to the window and jerked back the curtains, heart racing. Nothing. Just the familiar yard outside, darkened by the night, the trees bending slightly in the breeze. The motion she'd seen was gone, as if it had never been there at all. But when she turned to go back to bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She thought about it for a while, lying in the dark, her mind spinning with possibilities. But finally, she convinced herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her in the stillness of the night. The next night, it happened again. This time, she wasn't as quick to jump to her feet. She had learned to pause for a moment, to consider it, to calm herself. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it more clearly. There was a face, a man's face. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glimmer in the faint light of the street lamps outside. The skin was sickly white, stretched too tight over the bones, and the eyes, God, the eyes. They were wide, too wide, and stared right at her. The face was distorted, its features contorted in a way that made her breath hitch in her throat. And it was staring directly at her, staring as though it knew she was watching. This time, she didn't hesitate. She bolted out of bed, her feet hitting the cold floor with a thud as she rushed to the window. Her hands trembled as she yanked open the curtains, expecting to see only the quiet, empty yard. But instead, the face was still there. Closer. She recoiled, the hairs on her neck standing up, a deep sense of dread crawling up her spine like 1,000 unseen fingers. Her breath caught in her throat, and her legs nearly buckled under her as she stumbled back, heart racing in her chest. It's not possible, she thought. There's no one out there. It's just a trick of the light. It has to be. But when she looked again, the face was gone. She stayed up the rest of the night, the sheets twisted around her, her eyes darting to the window every few minutes, expecting the face to return. It didn't. But it was there again the next night. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. This time it was clearer, more solid, more real. She saw it as she lay there, trying to sleep, the moonlight casting a soft glow over her room. The face was back, pressed against the glass, its eyes wide and fixed on her. She could see the outline of the nose, the shape of the lips, a smile that was more of a grimace, something unnatural, something wrong. This time, she didn't wait. She jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, yanking the curtain aside with such force that the fabric nearly tore. But when she looked outside, there was nothing. The yard was empty, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, the distant street lamp flickering softly in the darkness. Her pulse raced, and her mind raced with it. She couldn't make sense of it. Was she losing her mind? Was this all just stress, just the weight of her life catching up to her? But no matter how she tried to reason with herself, the nagging sensation wouldn't go away. The feeling of being watched, of being seen, even when there was no one there. She couldn't shake it. The face had returned every night after that. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse, something that disappeared when she turned her head, a shadow in the corner of her vision. But over time, the face grew clearer, and it followed her, always closer. The distance between them closed inch by inch, night after night. She started leaving the curtains drawn, even during the day. It became a habit, a compulsive action she couldn't explain, but that only made it worse. The face came even when the curtains were drawn, peeking through the gaps. When she pulled the blinds to check, the face was always there, always closer. There was no escaping it, no hiding from it. It had become a ritual. She would wake up every night, heart pounding in her chest, drenched in sweat, and the first thing she'd do was look toward the window. It was a sickening feeling, a mix of fear and anticipation, like knowing something terrible was going to happen, and yet being unable to stop it. Every night, she'd reach for the curtains, half expecting to see it, the face. But when she pulled them back, the yard would be empty, as it always was. Still, she knew the truth. The face was getting closer. Janet couldn't explain it, but she could feel it. It was always watching, always waiting, moving in closer with each passing night. It had to be. It had to be, because she could feel its eyes, feel that presence, pressing against her skin like an invisible weight. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. The tension, the fear, it had reached a boiling point. She hadn't slept in days, had hardly eaten, and she was losing her mind. She stood at the window, staring out into the darkness, wondering if she was just imagining things. But when she looked to the left, there it was, a face, clear as day. This time she didn't move. She didn't run to the window or yank back the curtains. She just stood there, rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the face. It was closer, and it was smiling. Not a grin, not a friendly smile. It was a twisted, sickening curve of the lips, stretching wider than should have been possible. The eyes, those eyes, were too wide, too unblinking, and they seemed to burn into her. The air in the room grew colder. A chill that made her skin crawl, that made the back of her neck prickle with dread. She stepped closer to the window, drawn toward it like a moth to a flame, a strange pull, an invisible force that made her unable to stop. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, the face moved, slowly, deliberately. The face on the other side of the window didn't just watch her anymore. It reached. The fingers appeared first, long and thin, pressed against the glass, and then the rest of the hand, pale and cold, followed. It pressed against the window, the coldness of the glass merging with the coldness of the hand on the other side. Janet's breath caught in her throat as her fingers twitched, reaching for the curtains, almost without thinking. She had to pull them shut. She had to close it off. She couldn't let it get any closer. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stretched her fingers toward the curtain's edge, each movement slower, more deliberate than the last. The chill in the air deepened. It felt wrong, but she had to pull them shut. She had to. And then, through the glass, the face reached back. The fingers slid across the glass, and for the first time, Janet realized the worst part of it all. The face wasn't just on the other side of the window. It was already inside. Janet's hand froze mid-air, inches from the curtain. Her heart skipped a beat then thundered louder as though trying to escape her chest. The sensation was so sudden, so utterly foreign, that it took her a moment to process it. The face wasn't outside the window anymore. The thing, whatever it was, had already begun to move with its impossibly long, thin fingers as though it were merely reaching across the divide, passing through the glass like it was air. For a split second, the curtain had been nothing but a barrier between them, an illusion of safety. But that illusion was evaporating quickly, thinning like a piece of parchment left too long in the fire. Her breath hitched in her throat as she stared at the glass, her thoughts scrambling to catch up, her pulse echoing in her skull. The coldness, that sickening, unnatural chill, seeped into the room and tangled itself in her chest. The fingers were pressed flat against the glass, their length unnatural, stretched too far, as if they had been pulled out of their sockets, elongated and deformed to fit some dark, twisted purpose. The face on the other side of the window was close now, so close she could see the veins running through the pale, lifeless skin. The hollow, cavernous eyes stared through the glass with the same unblinking intensity, as though they could see all of her. She could feel the gaze, like a cold breath on her skin, watching her, measuring her, understanding her in a way she couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just that the face was closer now, it was inside, and that meant something far worse. It meant the boundaries between what was real and what wasn't had dissolved. Her hand trembled uncontrollably, still suspended, paralyzed by fear. The feeling in her throat was thick and suffocating, a knot that she couldn't swallow down, no matter how hard she tried. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, to pull the curtains closed before it was too late. But her body refused to listen. She didn't want to look back at it, but the pull was too strong. Slowly, reluctantly, she shifted her gaze back to the window. She saw the thing's fingers, its fingers moving slowly at first, gliding down the glass. The sensation of it was wrong, all wrong, like oil sliding across water. Smooth, slick, alien. The palm of its hand remained pressed flat, as though it were trying to make contact with her. As if it knew what she was about to do. Her legs felt like stone, but instinct finally kicked in. She jerked her hand toward the curtains, yanking them shut with a force that sent a sharp pain through her arm. The fabric rustled violently, blocking her view of the window, blocking her view of the thing on the other side. But the air in the room didn't return to normal. The chill lingered, hanging like a cloud of frost. Her body, even after she had pulled the curtains, felt as though it was still being watched. She backed away from the window, her feet stumbling over the floorboards. Her mind raced. There had to be an explanation. There had to be. Maybe it's just a trick of the light, she told herself, but even as the words echoed in her mind, she knew they were hollow. They couldn't convince her. She had seen it, felt it. She had seen the fingers on the glass. She had felt the gaze, the weight of those eyes. They were too real. The house felt wrong. The walls felt too close. The floor too cold under her bare feet. She glanced at the clock. It was past midnight, but her body felt so tense, so alert, that it seemed as though the night had only just begun. She couldn't sit still anymore. The room felt too small, the air in it too thick, like it was pressing down on her from all sides. Janet rubbed her eyes, blinking as though she could shake off the vision of those fingers, of that smile, if it could even be called a smile, that had twisted across the face behind the glass. For a moment, she thought she could hear something, a faint, scratching noise, a sound too soft to be real. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to drown it out, but it was still there. Just beneath the hum of the house, just below the whispers of the wind outside. It was coming from the window. Slowly she turned around. her legs unsteady as if the ground beneath her was shifting, pulling her toward the window once again. She tried to fight it, tried to push the feeling back down, but her body betrayed her, moving on its own, as if something in the room had taken control of her. The curtains were still drawn, but she could feel it. The thing, that presence, was out there, waiting. Without thinking, her hand reached for the curtain again, trembling as she gripped the fabric. Just look, just one more time. You have to know. She pulled the curtains back, half expecting the window to be empty, half hoping that everything was just a nightmare, a product of her frazzled nerves. But when the fabric parted, her breath caught again. The window was there, dark, empty. But the shadow, the shape, was still there. It was just beyond the glass, still pressed against the window as though it had never left. The outline of the thing, of the face, was more defined now, more pronounced. The fingers were longer, more grotesque, each knuckle bulging like they were too large for the hand they belonged to. The eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, stared back at her, unblinking, unyielding. The face was closer. Too close. She backed away from the window again, heart hammering in her chest. The air had grown thicker, cold, heavier, and now it wasn't just the fear that clawed at her. Now she felt something else, something worse. The sense of wrongness was overwhelming, suffocating, like an invisible weight was pressing down on her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. Her mind spun. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't keep doing this, watching it watch her. Her eyes darted to the door. Maybe she should go outside, get some fresh air, clear her head, but before she could move, she heard it again, the scratching noise. This time it was louder, clearer, the sound of something dragging against the glass, something scraping, reaching for her. She froze in place, her breath caught in her throat. The noise, it was coming from the inside of the window. Janet's hands gripped the edge of the curtain, her fingers digging into the fabric, trying to hold herself steady. But the weight in the air was too much. Her chest felt tight. Her pulse was a steady, pounding drumbeat that echoed in her ears. And then, without warning, the thing on the other side of the window moved again. Slowly, its features, twisted, pale, lifeless, shifted just enough for her to see them clearly. The smile spread wider this time, wider than before, as though it were delighted by the terror in her eyes. It wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside her mind. The reflection of its grin was so grotesque that it made her stomach twist. But it wasn't just the smile, no, it was the eyes. Those empty, wide eyes, they were moving, they were following her. And then it happened. The glass began to crack. Not a loud shattering, but a soft, sickening sound, like something fragile under pressure. Janet's eyes widened. The face moved even closer, pressing its forehead against the glass, and the crack deepened. It wasn't just a face on the other side anymore. It was coming through. Janet screamed, the sound piercing the air, but she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was too late. The thing was already inside. The glass shattered with a sudden, deafening crack, sharp, brittle, the sound like bones snapping, splintering in all directions. Janet's heart stopped. A jagged fissure ran through the window now, the cracks spidering outward like a web spun by a sick, twisted spider. The room, her room, grew colder. The temperature dropped so rapidly that she could see her breath in the air, white puffs that hung in the dimness of the night, like ghosts escaping from her mouth. Her heart thudded in her chest, the rhythm erratic, chaotic, as though it couldn't keep up with the sheer panic coursing through her veins. What the hell is happening? Her thoughts swirled like a tornado, a vortex of confusion and terror. She was paralyzed, her feet glued to the floor, her body frozen by the sheer weight of it. The glass, the window, was broken, cracked, but the face was still there, right in front of her. Pressed against the now damaged pane, its twisted, sickening smile stretched wider, the corners of its mouth pulling in unnatural angles. She tried to scream, to run, but the sound caught in her throat. The thing on the other side of the window had become something else, something more. It wasn't just a face anymore. It wasn't just a presence outside her window. The glass had cracked like a signal, an invitation for it to come closer, to enter her world, her space. It's coming for me. The thought sliced through her mind like a blade, and before she could process it, the air in the room seemed to grow even colder. For a brief, sickening moment, Janet thought she saw the face's eyes flicker, no, shift, and then the thing did the most horrific thing yet. It opened its mouth. The sound that came out wasn't a voice, it wasn't a whisper, a moan or a scream. It was something guttural, unnatural. The air seemed to hum around her as the thing's jaw dropped, and the room seemed to press inward. Her head spun. She could feel the temperature around her drop further, until her teeth were chattering uncontrollably, until she could feel the cold seeping deep into her bones. Janet stumbled backward, her legs refusing to carry her fast enough. I need to get out of here. I need to leave before it, but there was no time to think. The thing outside, inside, was pressing harder against the window, its fingers elongated and almost translucent, like thin branches reaching through the broken glass. Its face had pushed forward so close to the shards that she could see its teeth, yellowed, sharp, jagged, grinning at her. The glass rattled as the creature breathed, and she could hear it, the breath. It was slow, labored, like something trying to make itself known, trying to break through the barrier she had left behind, and it smelled of rot, of something decayed, something long dead. No, this isn't real, this isn't happening. Janet's mind screamed the words, but her body was frozen in place. The dread had dug so deep into her gut that it was hard to breathe. She had to move, but her legs were jelly, trembling with the shock of it all. And then, just as she thought she might lose herself to the suffocating fear, the thing on the other side of the window did something that pushed her beyond her breaking point. It reached. The fingers, long and gnarled, thin as tree branches, slid through the cracks in the glass as though it was stretching the window to its breaking point. The creature's palm pressed flat against the pane, its fingers curling inward, leaving dark, finger-shaped marks on the glass. The face that stared back at her, grinning, watching, was so close now that she could see the veins in its eyes, the deep blackness of the pupils swirling in endless darkness. The teeth were bared, sharp, gleaming like a predator's, and then the fingers, those long, brittle fingers, moved. Slowly. They started to poke through the cracks, wriggling, sliding, and Janet screamed, finally, loud and ragged, the sound ripping itself free from her throat. No! She tried to run. She tried to make it to the door, but her body felt sluggish, weighted down by terror. The thing outside, inside, moved again. It wasn't just the hand anymore, but an entire arm, long and slender, stretching through the fractured window. The room smelled of it now, of decay, of something rotting, and that horrible breath, ragged and hot, poured through the gaps in the glass, like a wave of cold mist coming from the creature's mouth. She backed up, stumbling, her legs buckling beneath her as she collided with the bedpost. She hit the ground hard, pain lancing up her back, but she barely noticed. The thing was coming, it was close, it was inside the window now, and the air felt thicker than ever. With the last of her strength, she scrambled toward the door, her hand reaching out, desperately searching for the handle. She could hear it now, the sound of the thing's breathing, ragged and sick, as it pressed its body closer to the broken window. She had almost reached the door when she heard it, the scraping sound, the scratching again, this time inside the room. She whipped around, eyes wide, barely able to take in the sight. The thing was pulling itself through the window. Not just the fingers now, the whole thing. It was coming through, its body bending and twisting in grotesque, unnatural angles, as if it was a thing of nightmare and not of flesh and blood. The air seemed to shudder around it, the walls seeming to flex, warping as though the reality itself was being twisted by the presence of the creature. Her hands were shaking. The door was right there. She could get out. She could leave, but she couldn't. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick, heavy, like there was no escape. And then the thing moved. It wasn't just its fingers or its arm anymore. The entire face, the head, pushed through the window, its features twisting and distorting as it came closer. The skin stretched unnaturally tight, pulling away from its skull, as though it was being forced into a shape that wasn't meant for it. The grin widened impossibly, and for a second Janet thought she saw something move behind the face, something darker, something larger, something inhuman. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. It reached for her, the arm now fully through the window, its fingers curling, extending toward her like claws, grasping, grabbing. Janet's heart stopped. It was like being caught in the jaws of a trap she couldn't escape from, her legs paralyzed, her body trapped in the suffocating grip of terror. The fingers reached out. She screamed again. This time, it was a raw, guttural sound that left her throat burning. And then, just as she thought the thing would close its grip around her, something strange happened. The creature, the thing, the face, paused. It stopped mid-reach, its claws hovering just above her, its head tilted as though considering something. It didn't move, it didn't advance. Janet's pulse raced. She was afraid to breathe, afraid to move, but she had to know. What was it doing? It stood there, unmoving for a long moment. The air around her seemed to freeze, everything locked in place, as if time had slowed. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the thing pulled back. It withdrew, its fingers jerking back through the window, its smile curdling into something worse, more twisted than ever. For a moment, Janet thought she had escaped, that the nightmare was over. But she knew better now. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The face on the other side of the window wasn't finished with her yet. Janet's breath came in shallow gasps, her chest heaving like she had just run miles through a blizzard. The thing had retreated, for now. But she knew better than to think that meant it was over. It hadn't gone anywhere, not really. It hadn't left, hadn't moved away from the window, hadn't stopped watching her. She could still feel it there, outside her vision, pressing against the glass, pushing its way closer. The air was thick with it, so thick she could hardly breathe. For a long, paralyzing moment, she stood frozen in place, her body trembling like a leaf in a windstorm, her mind spinning in endless circles, trying to comprehend what she had just witnessed. Her hands shook, her skin clammy, slick with cold sweat, and all the while she could feel that gaze, those eyes, on her, boring into her, carving through her like a knife. The thought that it could be watching her even now, somehow seeing her from inside her own house, was enough to make her stomach lurch. She glanced back at the window, the shattered glass reflecting only the faintest glimmers of the moonlight. The face was gone. The window was still intact now, but she knew the thing was out there. Somewhere. She could feel it. It wasn't gone. It had just taken a step back, a pause, as if savoring the moment before it decided what to do next. And then, as if on cue, there was that same scratching sound, a faint, gnawing noise from somewhere just behind her, from the window. Janet spun around, every muscle in her body locking in terror. Her eyes darted to the curtains, still drawn tightly, but that noise, That scratching, scraping noise was unmistakable. Something was moving outside, not just the usual wind against the glass, not the creak of old wood or the usual house noises. This was deliberate, like something was dragging its claws along the window frame, trying to find a way in. Her heart pounded in her ears. She took a step toward the door, her hand reaching out toward the handle, but something, some dark instinct, stopped her. It was too quiet now, too still. The air in the room was suffocating. Something was about to happen. She could feel it. The hair on her arms stood on end, her throat dry, as if her body was already preparing for the worst. Slowly, reluctantly, her eyes moved back toward the curtains. She couldn't help herself. She had to look. She had to know if it was still there. Her hand shook as it grasped the edge of the curtain, but she forced herself to pull it back, inch by agonizing inch. The window was cold against her fingertips. The room was too silent now, unnervingly silent. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart, echoing in her ears, and that scratching sound, soft but relentless, coming from beyond the window. And then, there it was, the face. Only, it wasn't quite like before. It was closer now, so close that the glass was fogging up in its wake, like its breath was pressing against the pane, its skin drawn tight against the window, like something trying to force its way through. The features were distorted, more malformed than they had been before. The smile was too wide, the eyes too dark. Its fingers, long, twisted, still wrapped around the frame, pressed in, as if it were trying to tear the window open. It was closer now, so close that Janet could see every detail in nauseating clarity. The veins in its eyes were no longer just visible, they were throbbing. The pupils flickered, twisting in unnatural ways, as though it were trying to peer into her, through her very soul. The skin stretched unnaturally tight over its skull, as though it were a mask wearing the face of something that wasn't quite human. The creature's teeth, jagged and sharp, gleamed in the faint light like knives, its tongue flicking out from between its teeth as if it were savouring something it couldn't quite taste. Her legs wobbled beneath her. The world spun. She had to get out. She had to leave before it got to her. But she couldn't move. Not yet. Not while the thing was so close. And then it smiled. It wasn't a grin anymore. It wasn't something playful or wicked. It was predatory. Its eyes locked onto hers, and for the briefest moment she thought it knew her, knew everything about her. There was something in its gaze, something dark and old and ancient that seemed to pierce her very core. She took a step back, barely aware of her own body. Her breath caught in her throat. It was moving again. The face was moving, pressing closer against the glass, the fingers wrapping tighter, digging into the frame, dragging the thing forward. Her stomach churned. She couldn't stop herself from letting out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward as she tried to escape the pull of its eyes. She pressed her back against the wall, but the room felt smaller. The shadows were closing in around her. The walls seemed to bend in on themselves. Everything was becoming too much. The thing outside, inside, was pulling her in. It was now just a matter of time. Time before it reached her. Time before it crawled through the glass and into her world. Number Janet slammed her eyes shut, trying to block it out. She tried to push the terror back down into the pit of her stomach, tried to convince herself that it wasn't real, that it was all in her head, but the sound, the breath, the scratching was real. That smell, that rank, decaying odor that had filled the room was real. She opened her eyes again, her breath ragged. The creature had withdrawn slightly, its face no longer pressed so tightly to the glass. But its eyes, those terrible, empty eyes, never left hers. They followed her no matter where she went, no matter how far back she retreated into the room. They were there, watching her. And then, slowly, agonizingly, it did something that made her blood run cold. It winked, not in the way someone might wink in jest, but in a way that felt far too intimate, far too knowing, as if it understood her fear, her helplessness, and it was savoring it. The thing on the other side of the window was aware of her in a way that went beyond mere presence. It had seen her, understood her. And then the sound of the glass of the window began to shift again. Janet's hand shot to her mouth, biting down on her knuckles to stifle a scream, her eyes wide as she watched the window begin to bend and warp. The glass was distorting, the frame groaning as though the thing outside was slowly, deliberately, forcing its way in. Her chest tightened, the pressure was unbearable, suffocating as though the walls themselves were closing in on her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. With trembling hands, she turned and bolted for the door, her feet stumbling against the floor. The scraping was louder now, the sound of claws against wood and glass, a symphony of terror that echoed through her very bones. She was almost there, almost, and then the thing struck. It wasn't the glass that shattered, but the air itself, the pressure of it, pressing inward, too strong for her to handle. Janet let out a desperate scream, and just as she reached the door, the thing's fingers closed around her ankle. It yanked her backward, dragging her toward the window. She could feel its cold, rancid touch seeping through her skin, the freezing sensation of its grip pulling her deeper into the darkness. Her scream was cut short as she felt herself being yanked, pulled into its world. The room, the house, the very fabric of her reality, everything twisted around her, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was about to become part of whatever nightmare had been waiting just outside her window. Janet's scream was swallowed by the darkness that consumed her, an all-encompassing force, heavy and thick, wrapping around her like the grip of some unseen hand. She was pulled backwards, dragged with terrifying strength, her legs skidding across the cold, hard floor, her heart pounding like the frantic drumbeat of a funeral march. She reached for the door, her fingers grazing the handle, but it was too late. She was already being yanked back into the room, into the suffocating grip of whatever waited beyond that window. The thing, the face, was closer now, its fingers, long, pale, twisted, wrapping around her leg like a snake, tugging her toward the broken window, dragging her toward that monstrous presence. Its grip was cold, so cold it felt like fire, the freezing sensation cutting through her flesh and down to the marrow of her bones. Every breath was sharp, ragged, every inhale like a painful rasp in her throat, but it wasn't enough to stop the suffocating pressure around her chest. She couldn't move, she couldn't think, she couldn't breathe. And then it grinned. The face on the other side of the window had stretched itself too thin, too tight, like a thing trying to break free of its skin. The smile was wide, too wide, its mouth stretching impossibly, pulling back in a grotesque, unnatural manner, revealing jagged teeth that gleamed like shards of glass. The air in the room grew heavy. The walls seemed to bend in on themselves, the ceiling dropping closer and closer, as if the very space around her was being warped by its presence. Janet could feel the cold seeping into her lungs, her skin sinking deep into the very essence of her being. Her limbs went numb, her fingers shaking with the cold as she gripped the floor for purchase. But there was nothing solid left to hold on to. She was being sucked into the darkness. Her foot slammed against the door, her heels scraping the wood as she tried to wrench it open, but her legs felt like lead. The creature's grip was unyielding, dragging her back with terrifying strength, pulling her toward the window, toward its teeth, toward the smile that now stretched wider with every heartbeat. She screamed again, but this time there was no sound, nothing but the horrific buzzing in her ears, the rush of blood as it thudded against the walls of her skull. The room had become a trap, the very air holding her captive as if she had been imprisoned within the prison of her own mind. With one last desperate cry, Janet threw herself forward, her body pitching toward the door, the creature's fingers loosening just for a split second. She grabbed the handle, twisted it with all her remaining strength, and flung herself out of the room. But the thing was still there, waiting, still following her. The hallway stretched before her, endless, dark and suffocating, like the inside of a tomb. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the floor felt unsteady beneath her feet, as though it too was shifting, warping in response to the thing that was moving behind her. She didn't dare look back. Just run, just keep running, get out of here. The mantra echoed in her mind as her bare feet slapped against the cold floor, the panic in her chest making every step feel heavier than the last. The hall twisted before her eyes, the doorways opening into rooms that seemed to stretch out too far, rooms that didn't exist, rooms that didn't belong here. Just keep running. The air seemed to shift with every step, becoming more oppressive, thick with the presence of something that didn't belong. She could feel it behind her, just out of sight, but it was there. She knew it was there. Her pulse raced, her lungs burned as if they were filled with smoke. Every footfall seemed to echo louder in the silence, each step pulling her deeper into the nightmarish maze she had found herself in. The house, her house, was no longer hers. It had become a living thing, a twisting, monstrous entity that was closing in on her, drawing her back, back to the window, back to that thing that was waiting. She had to get out. She had to escape. And then it was there. The sound of its breath was like a low, rasping growl, filling the space behind her like a predator stalking its prey. Janet spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The air in front of her shimmered, wavered, and for a brief moment she thought she saw the faintest outline of it, a figure just beyond the edge of the hallway, its eyes glowing in the dim light, its smile stretching wider, its teeth bared. The face. It's coming for me. The thought struck her like a hammer, a brutal, all-consuming realization, and then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something move, a shadow shifting in the darkness, a shape, no, a form that seemed to be crawling toward her. The walls trembled, the house groaned as if it was alive, the very foundations of it shaking. Janet could hear the creak of floorboards from all directions, beneath her feet, above her head. The house was folding in on itself, bending, breaking, warping, just as the thing outside the window had done. It's here. She couldn't breathe. The air felt so thick now, heavy with the presence of the thing that had been outside her window. She could feel it closing in around her, creeping through every crack, every corner. She could feel the pressure in the air like it was pushing against her skin, pressing in from every side. She took a step backward, her mind racing. She needed a way out, a way to escape. But the doorways were all wrong. They were too dark, too empty, and the rooms stretched on forever. She didn't know where she was going anymore, and then, with a sickening lurch, the ceiling above her cracked. She looked up just in time to see the figure descending from above, its distorted face grinning down at her, its body melting through the ceiling, its fingers reaching through the cracks, tearing its way into the room. Janet didn't wait. She turned and ran, but it was too late. The walls collapsed. The air suffocated her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She felt the cold fingers on her arm, cold, sharp, pulling her back toward the thing, and then dark. It was so cold, so quiet, and in the silence she heard it, the whisper, soft and chilling, coming from somewhere far away. "I've been waiting for you." She hadn't planned on staying here for long. It was supposed to be a temporary thing, a stopgap, really, while she sorted out her life. The apartment was cheap, tucked away on the outskirts of the city in an aging building that had seen better days. But things had gone wrong with her last lease, and when she found the ad online, she jumped on it. A fresh start in a place that had a certain worn charm to it. The rent was low, and after everything that had happened in her life recently, she didn't care so much about the details. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, something had started to settle into the walls. A deep, slow, rhythmic thumping that she couldn't ignore, no matter how much she tried. It wasn't the pipes, it wasn't the wind, it was something else, something buried deep in the bones of the building itself. It wasn't just a sound, it felt like a presence, a heartbeat echoing from the walls like the pulse of some forgotten creature. At first, she'd told herself it was nothing. The building was old, full of creaks and groans, as old buildings tended to be. She'd pushed the feeling out of her mind, rationalizing it away as she unpacked her things, arranged her books on the shelf, and began the quiet process of settling in. But it didn't go away, and now, weeks later, it was worse. The rhythm was unrelenting, always present, always there, as if it had settled into her bones. It wasn't just a sound she could hear, it was something she could feel. The very air around her seemed to vibrate with it. She could sense it, even when she wasn't in the room where it was loudest. When she lay in bed, the pulse seemed to hum in the air, joining her own heartbeat in an uncomfortable, synchronized rhythm. Lena had started sleeping with a pillow over her head, trying to drown it out, but it didn't help. The pulse was inside her now, too. Every time she closed her eyes, it throbbed in her temples, deep, slow, steady. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, sometimes from beneath the floorboards, sometimes from above, but it always came from within the apartment, never outside, never from the street. Her mind kept circling back to the same thought. It's just an old building, the pipes, the settling, something normal, something I can't control. But the feeling never let up. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. It felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge it, like it was pacing just behind her, just outside her line of sight. Every time she tried to ignore it, it grew louder. She had come to the apartment after everything had fallen apart, after the failed relationships, after the job she hated, after the weight of being on her own again. She'd left her old apartment on impulse, tired of the memories it held. She had no particular attachment to this place, no deep need for it. It was a place to live, that was all. But now, as the pulse in the walls deepened, she began to wonder if it had chosen her, if the apartment itself had some dark need that she wasn't aware of. Lena paced the apartment one evening, the weight of the sound pressing against her skull like a vice. She rubbed her temples, trying to force herself to relax. The clock on the wall ticked, the only other sound in the room. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside, but still the thrum in the walls persisted, always there, always present, beating in time with her heart. Thump, thump, thump. She had been through a lot in the past year, but this was something else. This felt wrong. Something was here, something she couldn't explain. It wasn't a rat. It wasn't the pipes. It was something else, something old. And whatever it was waking up. The apartment was supposed to be a fresh start, but it was becoming clear that this place was anything but new. Lena stepped to the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the wall as she listened. The pulse came from here, from this place, but she couldn't trace it. The more she tried, the further it seemed to recede. She felt trapped, suffocated by the rhythm, like it was keeping her tethered to the apartment. She pressed her palm against the plaster, but there was no crack, no indication of where the sound might be coming from. Thump, thump, thump. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the beat. The air around her pulsed, thick with the sensation. It wasn't just a sound. It wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was in the air, in the room, in her chest. Every beat was louder, clearer. It had become part of her. "What is this?" She stumbled back, her chest tight with fear. For the first time since she'd moved in, Lena felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The walls were closing in around her, and no matter how much she tried to escape it, the rhythm kept pulling her back. She had to find out what was causing it. She had to know, but where to start? Lena turned to the only place she could think to look, the building itself. She had no idea who lived here before her, no idea what had happened in the years before she signed the lease. Perhaps there were answers to be found. If she could dig into the building's history, she might understand what was going on, might figure out why she could feel this strange, heavy pulse in the walls. The next morning, Lena visited the building's super, an older man named Frank, who had lived in the building for years. He was hunched over, slow, but his eyes had a sharpness to them that belied his age. "Is there anything strange about this place?" she asked, voice steady despite the knot of fear in her stomach. "Anything unusual? Anything people don't talk about?" Frank blinked at her, his brow furrowed. "You've heard it too, huh?" The way he said it sent a chill down Lena's spine. "The heartbeat," he said, his voice low, as if telling a secret. "Some of the old-timers who lived here used to talk about it. Never paid it any mind. Figured it was just the building's age catching up with it, you know? But you hear it long enough, and it starts getting to you." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Frank looked down at his feet, then back up at her, his eyes tired. "Some things in this building aren't quite as they seem. You need to be careful, girl. It's an old place and it's got history." Lena stared at him, trying to keep the panic from rising in her throat. "What kind of history?" But Frank only shook his head and turned away, mumbling something under his breath. "Don't go digging too deep, that's all I'm saying." Lena stood there for a moment, feeling the pulse in her chest, align with the rhythm in the walls. Whatever this was, it was real, and it wasn't going away. She had no choice now. She had to know what was inside the walls of this place, because it was clear now. It knew she was here, and it wasn't going to stop. Lena sat in the corner of her apartment, the faded armchair creaking beneath her weight, her eyes fixated on the silent walls around her. Frank's words echoed in her head like a low, lingering hum, mingling with the ever-present thrum from the walls. It was as if they were connected, the strange old man's warning and the pulse inside the apartment. She couldn't get it out of her mind. Don't go digging too deep. But what else could she do? The sound in the walls had become too much, too insistent, too real to ignore. It had invaded her thoughts, her every waking moment, and now it had even seeped into her dreams. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the walls bending and warping, the pulse inside them growing, beating louder, faster. She couldn't escape it, no matter where she went. That evening she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of old newspapers she'd found while going through the building's history. She had done her best to trace its past, but it wasn't as simple as she'd hoped. The landlord hadn't been much help. He'd brushed her off, muttering something about outdated records and long-forgotten tenants. But Frank's comment lingered in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been hidden from her. Something important. There were few clues in the stack of papers. Most of it was typical for an old building, a handful of obituaries, articles about the building's initial construction in the 1920s, a few records about renovations. But there was a strange gap in the records, one that seemed to coincide with the years leading up to her move-in. It was as though there were missing pages, documents that had been deliberately left out, or worse, erased. Lena leaned forward, her fingers tracing the yellowed edges of an old article. It was a story about a fire that had consumed part of the building's lower levels, a fire that had tragically claimed several lives. But there was no mention of what had happened afterward, nothing about the building's repair or the tenants who had come and gone. Just a vague reference to the fact that construction had resumed. She felt the pulse again, thump, thump, thump. It was louder now, thrumming deep within the walls like the steady pounding of a drum. Her skin prickled as the sensation of being watched crept over her once more. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as though something or someone was just beyond the thin plaster that separated her from the unknown. She shuddered. "Why can't I just leave?" she whispered to herself. But she didn't leave. She couldn't. Something anchored her here, something that was beginning to feel like a trap, a force that was slowly tightening its grip around her. She had to finish this. She had to know the truth, no matter what. Her mind turned back to the fire, the one mentioned in the article, a fire that had taken place decades ago. She knew she had to dig deeper. There had to be something more, something she hadn't seen yet. She couldn't allow herself to become distracted by the noise in the walls. She had to finish what she had started. Lena stood, grabbing the flashlight she kept next to her bed for the nights when the power flickered. She was determined now. She wouldn't let fear rule her. She would find out what lay behind the walls, what was causing the thrum. The apartment was old, sure, but there was something in it, something unnatural. The apartment had grown colder since the first time she'd felt it, this weight, this oppressive energy pressing down on her chest. It was as if the air had turned thick with it, making her movements sluggish, her thoughts clouded. The lights flickered as she made her way down the narrow hallway toward the far wall where she'd first noticed the pulse. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was almost deafening now, vibrating the floor beneath her bare feet. It was coming from the very heart of the building, somewhere deep behind the plaster, behind the old wood. She walked to the wall, the place where she had pressed her ear against the surface the night before. Her breath came quick and shallow as she knelt down, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. She swept it across the baseboards, the cracks, looking for any sign of movement, anything that would explain the noise, the force. For a long time, there was nothing. And then, just as she was about to give up, the wall shifted. It was imperceptible at first, a slight bulging, a faint cracking sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She gasped, her heart skipping a beat. It felt as though something was moving inside the wall, pushing against the plaster from the other side. She pressed her ear to the wall again, the thrum pounding in her chest, growing louder and more insistent. "It's close now," she thought, "so close. Thump, thump, thump." The rhythm was so deep now she could feel it in her bones. The pulse seemed to sync with her own heartbeat, like it was drawing her closer. She pulled back, the flashlight trembling in her hand. Her breath hitched as she saw something she hadn't noticed before, small, black marks on the wall, thin, dark lines like scratches or stains running in uneven patterns across the plaster. What is this? Her fingers brushed against one of the marks. It was damp, slick, like something had seeped through the wall, like the very essence of the apartment was oozing from its pores. She recoiled, heart pounding, as her mind raced to understand what she was seeing. The thrum in the walls grew louder, the pulse reverberating through the room. It was all around her now, suffocating her, drowning out all rational thought. Lena's hands shook as she reached for the flashlight again, her fingers trembling as she lifted it higher. She pointed it at the ceiling, and for the briefest of moments she thought she saw something moving in the shadows above her. But when she turned the light fully on it, there was nothing there. It was just the shadows, just her imagination. She couldn't allow herself to believe in ghosts, in anything supernatural. She had to stay grounded. She had to be rational. But the way the walls were breathing, the way they pulsed beneath her skin, it made it impossible to ignore. She pulled away from the wall, too frightened to stay any longer. She backed up, her pulse quickening, her mind screaming at her to leave, to run. But there was nowhere to run. The apartment was vast and hollow and so old, it felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was everywhere. It was in the walls, it was in her head, it was in her chest. Lena knew in that moment that whatever was in these walls wasn't just something she could leave behind. It wasn't a ghost or a memory. It wasn't a malfunctioning pipe or a creaking floorboard. It was alive, and it wasn't going to stop. Lena didn't sleep that night. She sat on the couch, her body stiff, her eyes wide open, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. The pulse, the relentless rhythmic thrum, continued to pound through the very fabric of the apartment, louder now, almost insistent, like the echo of some unseen heart. It wasn't just the walls anymore. The pulse seemed to throb in the air, reverberating through her own chest, syncing with her heartbeat until she could hardly tell the difference between the two. It had been a long time since she had felt this exposed. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the sensation of something moving inside the walls, or the creeping suspicion that she might not be alone. That whatever was behind the thumping wasn't a mere manifestation of her own fear, but something real, something that had been here long before her. Her mind kept circling back to Frank's words, the cryptic warning that hadn't made sense at the time. But now it did. He hadn't told her what to look for, or even how to fight it, but she knew instinctively that the heartbeat was something that had been here for a long time. She had been warned to stay away from it, but it was already inside her, seeping into her thoughts, into her body, into her very soul. She couldn't stop it. The pulse echoed through the night, through every corner of her apartment. She had tried closing her eyes, but it was always there, beneath her skin, behind her eyelids, pushing against the thin veil of sleep. Lena had spent hours searching the apartment, trying to find some explanation, something, anything that could make sense of the pulsing, the scratching, the strange vibrations in the walls. But all she had found were more unanswered questions. She had considered calling the landlord, but that seemed pointless. After all, he had barely acknowledged the issue when she'd brought it up, and the last thing she needed was a half-hearted excuse for why the place was falling apart. She couldn't afford to move again. Not now, not after everything she'd already been through. This apartment, for better or worse, had become her refuge. But now it felt more like a cage. She was trapped. Lena grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The cold air hit her face, sharp and clear, and for a brief moment she let herself breathe, really breathe, without the pressure of the walls and the pulse. She walked down the narrow street, her boots crunching against the sidewalk as she moved. It wasn't much of a neighborhood, just a row of weather-beaten buildings, a few streetlights casting pale pools of light on the pavement. But she was used to it. It was quiet. It was anonymous. But as she walked, a strange sensation gripped her, a feeling of being watched. She quickened her pace, the thrum in her chest quickening with each step. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and the pulse seemed to follow her. Everywhere she went, it was there. It was in the air around her, vibrating in her bones. Even on the street, under the dim glow of the street lamps, it felt like it was getting closer. It's not just in the walls anymore, is it? She thought, her feet moving faster, almost breaking into a run. The sensation of being followed grew stronger, and she found herself looking over her shoulder, but there was no one there, no footsteps, no shadows in the corner of her vision. But still the feeling persisted, relentless and suffocating. She stopped, standing in the middle of the street, her hands clenched at her sides. The thrum was nearly deafening now, and her heart was pounding in her chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the pulse in the walls. Thump, thump, thump! Her chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She had to go back. She couldn't run. She couldn't escape it. The sound was already there, following her, closing in on her. Lena turned, feeling a wave of nausea wash over her. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. As she forced herself back toward the apartment, the beat in her chest accelerating. Every step she took seemed to pull her back toward the building, toward the walls. She hurried up the stairs to the door of her apartment, fumbling with her keys. The pulse was louder now, too loud, as if the walls themselves were vibrating with the force of it. She unlocked the door and stumbled inside, her breathing shallow, her heart racing. The apartment was dark, but the pulse was there, inescapable, a constant companion. She slammed the door shut behind her, but it didn't stop the noise. It never stopped. Lena sank down onto the couch, her hands shaking as she tried to gather herself. The silence of the apartment had been swallowed by the rhythmic pounding, and for the first time she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something more than just the fear of the unknown. It felt like a warning, a signal that whatever was in those walls, whatever was causing the pulse, was drawing closer. She had to figure it out. There was no other choice. The longer she let it go, the worse it would get. But how? Where was she supposed to start? Her eyes flicked to the corner of the room, the far wall where the pulse was the loudest. She could feel it in her bones now, could feel the pressure building from behind the walls, like something was pressing against them, pushing its way out. She wasn't imagining it anymore. It was real. And she wasn't sure if she could survive it. The night stretched on in an agonizing crawl. Every creak, every whisper of movement in the apartment seemed to come from the walls, from the spaces between the plaster. She could hear it, feel it, the heartbeat growing in intensity. Thump, thump, thump. The sound reached a fever pitch, and she couldn't take it anymore. She had to confront it. Whatever was in the walls, whatever was in her chest, she had to face it. There was no running from this. Lena stood, her body trembling. She walked to the far corner of the room, where the sound seemed to pulse the hardest, and pressed her hand to the wall. Her fingers tingled at the contact, as if the very surface was alive with the rhythm. The pulse quickened, and she could feel it deep within the structure of the building. It was alive, she realized, and it was waiting for her. The last thing she remembered before everything went black was the sound, a terrible, deafening thrum, and then, for the briefest of moments, a face, a distorted image in the shadow behind the wall, watching her. Lena awoke with a jolt, the air thick around her, every muscle in her body stiff with a mixture of fear and confusion. Her eyes shot open to find her hands clutching the couch cushion as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. She took a few unsteady breaths, the pulse in her chest hammering as her mind reeled. Had she fallen asleep? Had she passed out? It felt as though only moments had passed, but the pounding in her chest, the thrum that had been inside the walls was still there. It was suffocating, relentless, and unyielding. She forced herself upright, her limbs aching as she stood. The apartment was still cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. But even in the dimness, she could see it. The walls, the corners, the edges of the room seemed different. Something was off. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The pulse. Thump, thump, thump. It was louder than before. Louder, deeper, closer. It wasn't just the walls anymore. The pulse felt like it was inside her. She could hear it in her ears like a low hum beneath her thoughts. It was everywhere. The rhythmic thrum filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards, the air, her very bones. It was almost as if the building was breathing, alive, conscious. She felt a cold sweat break out along her spine as her hands shook uncontrollably. The sound was overwhelming, pressing against her, forcing her body to move, to act. But the fear was paralyzing. She was frozen in place, trapped in this nightmare that had become her reality. Lena closed her eyes, taking slow, deliberate breaths to calm herself. She had to focus. She couldn't afford to lose herself to panic. This wasn't just fear anymore. It was something much more dangerous, something ancient. Forcing her eyes open, she stumbled toward the wall again, her feet unsteady beneath her. The pulse seemed to guide her, pulling her toward it, urging her to confront whatever was on the other side, whatever was behind those walls. Her fingers hovered over the cracks she had noticed earlier. They were still there, dark and wet, like the building itself was leaking something wrong, something unnatural. She pressed her palm against the wall, feeling the cold surface. The vibration was stronger now, a violent tremor that made her teeth rattle. It was as though the very foundation of the apartment was alive, thrumming with power. Suddenly she felt it, a strange warmth seeping through the wall. It wasn't heat, not like a radiator or a furnace. No, this was different. It felt like the wall was pulsing with some kind of life. Is it coming from the building itself, she thought, or is it something else? The thought terrified her, but she couldn't pull away. She couldn't stop herself from touching the wall, from pressing her ear against it, hoping for a sound, any sound that might explain what was happening. Her fingers tingled, a strange electric sensation coursing through them, as if the wall was responding to her touch. The thrum was steady, constant, an unmistakable heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. It was faster now, like something was rushing, moving, pushing against the walls, eager to escape. Lena staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. Something was trying to get out. Something was coming. She turned, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and sway unnaturally, moving with a life of their own. The apartment was too still, too quiet in between the beats. And then the unmistakable sound came again, the creaking of wood, the scraping of something moving against the drywall. Lena's heart stopped in her chest. It's not just the pulse anymore. The sound was unmistakable. Something was moving inside the wall. She could hear it now, the scratching, the shuffling, like something was crawling just beyond the surface. She was no longer imagining it. She wasn't hallucinating. Whatever was behind the wall was alive, and it was awake. Her pulse raced in her chest as she backed toward the door. She needed to leave. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't face whatever was coming. But the door wouldn't open. Her fingers were slick with sweat, and she fumbled with the doorknob, desperate to escape, but it was stuck. The knob refused to turn. Panic began to claw at her throat. She felt trapped, suffocated, as though the apartment itself had turned into some kind of prison. Her hands slid down the door, and she sank to the floor in helpless frustration. Thump, thump, thump. The pulse was deafening now, a living thing that seemed to fill the entire space. She could feel it pressing against her, wrapping around her, pushing her deeper into the corner. The floor beneath her feet trembled, as if the apartment was shifting, moving with the rhythm of the heartbeat. The walls groaned, as though protesting something or someone that had dared to disturb them. And then she saw it. At first it was just a flicker, just a brief glimpse of something moving in the shadow. But it grew clearer, closer. She blinked, her vision blurring, but she saw it again. A face. Not just any face, but a face that seemed to be looking at her. The face was distorted, twisted, stretched across the shadowed surface of the wall. It wasn't her reflection, it wasn't anyone she recognized, but the eyes. They were the most disturbing part. They were wide, unblinking, staring straight into hers like they had always been there, waiting for her to notice. The pulse seemed to intensify, and Lena's breath caught in her throat. Her body tensed as the face moved. It wasn't just a reflection, it was alive. It was pressing against the wall, trying to get through. The room seemed to tilt, the floor swaying beneath her feet. Lena pushed herself backward, her head spinning, her vision narrowing. She couldn't think straight. All she could hear was the pulse. All she could see was the face, inching closer to her, its mouth stretching into a grotesque grin that sent icy chills down her spine. Her fingers fumbled at the door once again, but the knob was still locked in place. She could hear the creaking now. The sound wasn't just coming from the wall anymore. It was coming from the floor, from the ceiling. The apartment itself was moving. The walls were shifting. Thump, thump. The heartbeat was everywhere now. It was inside her, in her mind, in her soul. It was suffocating her. But the worst part was the face. It was smiling. It was so close now, just inches from her. And its eyes were hers. She felt her chest tighten as she looked closer, the horror sinking in like a poison. It wasn't just watching her. It was waiting for her to become part of it. And then, with a sickening finality, the face reached for her. Its fingers, thin and long, emerged from the wall, pushing through the plaster like it was nothing. Lena screamed. Lena's scream tore through the suffocating silence, an instinctual cry that seemed to echo far beyond the walls of her apartment. But it was a sound that no one would ever hear. No one could save her. Not now. The face was already too close, its fingers emerging like skeletal limbs from the plaster, reaching for her with a slow, deliberate pace. Its fingers were long and gnarled, covered in what looked like a mixture of shadow and dust, the skin as pale as death itself, twitching with each unholy heartbeat. The thrum in her chest was deafening. It reverberated against her ribs, louder than ever before. It was as though the walls were not just alive, they were suffocating her, pushing in on every side. She could no longer tell where the noise ended and her own heartbeat began. The rhythm was one with her, and she could feel it in every inch of her skin. The face's grin widened, its expression twisted into something primal and grotesque. Lena could feel the heat of its breath, even though it was still just beyond the plaster. She tried to move, but her limbs were frozen, her body locked in place by some unseen force. Fear had paralyzed her, but there was something else too, something darker. It was the pulse, the heartbeat. It was alive, and it had been living in her skin for days. The fingers pressed against the wall with an unsettling scrape, the plaster crumbling in places, as if the face was not only pushing out, but tearing through the very fabric of reality itself. Lena felt the entire room tremble in time with the pulse, and it was as though the walls themselves were breathing, coming alive. A strange sensation began to crawl under her skin, like the pulse was syncing with her own heartbeat, tying her to whatever was hiding inside the walls. It's not just the walls, it's inside me. The thought broke through her panic like a cold wave. Her body throbbed, her chest tightening with every beat, and she gasped for air as she stared at the grotesque fingers inching toward her. The face, with its empty eyes, her eyes, was laughing now, laughing in a way that felt more like a low growl, a hollow sound that seeped into the marrow of her bones. It was a laugh that didn't belong to any human being. Lena's vision blurred, the edges of the room growing darker, and her knees buckled. She could feel her body betraying her, as though it were no longer her own. The pulse, the thrum, it was inside her now, not just in the walls, not just in the air, but in her very veins. The room spun. She reached for something, anything, and to steady herself, but her fingers brushed against the wall and it felt wrong. It was too soft, too alive. As if the wall itself had become a living, breathing thing. The moment her skin touched it, a sickening sensation crept through her fingertips, as if the plaster had a pulse of its own. Her eyes snapped back to the face in the wall, but it was too late. The fingers were already through the surface, the grotesque hand now fully visible. It twisted unnaturally as it reached toward her throat, fingers curling in a way that human fingers never could. This isn't real. The thought flickered in her mind, a last-ditch effort to fight against the nightmare. But as the hand reached out for her, as it tightened around her throat, the truth hit her like a physical blow. It was real, and it had been waiting for her. Lena's breath hitched in her throat as the fingers dug into her skin, cold and unyielding, like steel. The pulse, her pulse, was so strong now that it almost felt as though it were the only thing keeping her alive. Her chest heaved, but no air came, only a rhythmic pressure pushing in on her. Her vision blurred as her hands scrambled at the wall behind her, her nails scraping against the soft, yielding surface. The hand tightened, pulling her closer to the wall, dragging her toward it. The face's grin stretched wider, and Lena could feel her body being consumed by the shadow like it was swallowing her whole. It wasn't just pulling her into the wall, it was pulling her into it, into whatever this thing was, the thing behind the wall. And then, in the terrifying moment between life and death, Lena's mind did something she hadn't expected. It let go. She wasn't sure how or why. Maybe it was the thrum in her chest, that persistent, pulsing heartbeat that had consumed everything around her. Maybe it was the terror that she could no longer outrun, or the hopelessness that sank into her bones. But suddenly, the panic that had gripped her seemed to evaporate, leaving only numbness in its wake. She wasn't fighting anymore. In the eerie silence that followed, her heart slowed to match the rhythm of the thing in the walls. Thump, thump, thump. And then with a sickening crunch, the fingers released their grip, and the hand vanished back into the wall as though it had never been there. The pulse began to fade, the thrum in her chest growing quieter, until it was nothing but a distant echo, far away, but still present. The face, the monstrous thing in the wall, was gone. Lena stood there, trembling. Her body was covered in cold sweat, and her breath came in shallow gasps. The wall, once alive with the presence of something ancient, now stood still, its surface smooth and unbroken. For a moment, she wondered if everything had been a dream, if the horrors she had just faced were nothing more than figments of her imagination, forged by the fear that had taken root inside her. But as she looked around, she saw it. A single crack in the corner of the wall, just a thin line, a sliver of darkness, where the plaster had begun to crumble once again. And through the crack, she heard it. Thump, thump, thump. Her blood ran cold. It was still there, waiting. Lena couldn't help but smile, a bitter, hollow smile. She wasn't sure what was worse, that the thing in the walls was still alive, or that it would never stop. No matter what she did, it would always be there. She had become part of it now, and the heartbeat was never going to stop.